Shalom Aleichem Atayra Brider. Aleichem Shalom Me'atav Adoilam. Today is Thursday, Yud Ches Chai Kislev Hey Tov Shin Pei Hey, and it's Erev Rosh Hashanah Ladach. Tachel Shana v'Kilale Seha v'Tachel Shana Birchei Seha, and everything can be explained by Pnimis HaAnyanim. It means a kleine Schwachkeit, not Chas v'Sham Hepechatev, or the bitter of Hepechatev, and the Rabkum and Brachas b'Tev Nidav Anigla Cholechet v'Achas miYisrael b'Tev lehem b'Gashmius u'Beruchnius be'elam hazeh ha'Maisa l'mato ma'asor t'fochem. And since it's the Roshana Pnimius HaTorah, so it deals with Inyan and Pnimiyim, like the Rebbe Rashab writes in his letter, Zayim Tchilas Masecha, the Ikir Kavan of the Pnimius Abriya. But the Pnimius Abriya is the Sava Kodesh Baruch Liyas Leis Baruch Diri B'Tachtoinim, which means as Ozayin Yidden Gut Begashmius Be'elam Hazeh HaMaisa Be'Pashtas On Chochmes No Lomdes. They shall Hiten Yidden. Hashem should protect the Jewish people wherever they are. They should come home safe and sound to their families, and the Yidden should be strong. And Hashem should continue showing these incredible nisim and neflois, and there'll be real shalom, shalom amiti in the world. And shalom amiti is v'shchaftam ve'ein macharit, cherev shal shalom ve'sava b'yartzechem ve'salachti b'seichechem ve'yitzi lechem l'leikim, like the Rebbe spoke by the Lag B'Yemei Parade Tafshin Chav Zayin. The Rebbe should mention, Hashem should bless us all, that it should be now, and should be zeichet to this galus of Melech HaMashiach taken from a yad noch far Rosh Hashanah L'chsidis. Rosh Hashanah L'chsidis will be with Nugiloyim of Teras Hashem Mashiach Sidkenu Amen. I am, as you can see, not home. I'm in Aventura, which is in South Florida. It's a Yutas Kislev trip. I'm in 3 different cities, Mitzvah Hashem, all here in the bottom of America, bottom of the east coast of America, as it were. And so it's Blinen Fabrengenischen, and I know this class is not being posted live, but I plan to post the Fabrengens tonight and Matzah Shabbos and Sunday night Mitzvah Hashem, to broadcast them live. First of all, the Shir Zechus Le'ilu Nishmas HaKodsh Tzvi Ben Alexander HaKoyen Hashem Yimkim Dome. Hashem Debishal Benchen Zayin Almoneh mit alle Broches Be'elam Hazeh HaMaisa Bakel Mikol Kev Bakel Mikol Keil. Und soll sicher sein zu der richtige Akizu veran und Shechni offer hu bereishem hu betechem Amen. The Shir is also schos for Lilu Nishmas Moshe Yehuda ben Tzvi Yosef Rabbi Moshe Ketlarski. That's mamish and nebachin of chaval al da abdin v'lo mishtakhin, in a way of emes lamite. And it's schos for the four Shleimah from Merchaim ben Chayetzira, Liebe Breine bas Alta Miriam, Shleimah Yosef ben Risha, Bracha Adasa ben Gutken, Chaya Mushka bas Natal. Hashem should bless them all, not just with the Vahale Arucha, but with a Refuah Shlema. We'll start with the Arucha. First of all, give them an extension. Und danach, von der Arucha soll kommen der Refuah Shlema, B'Teva Nidav Anigla, especially we're going to Rosh Hashanah. It's a new year, new brachas, new koiches, new giluyim, new oises u'meifsim. A new cheshbon, it should be a new cheshbon, B'Tev Lanu, Tomid Kol HaYom, Amenelam Hazeh HaMaisa. Now Rabbi say, it's before Chanukah, which is early for me, and I'm doing Basi Legani. I've made many trips to Florida on Yutas Kislev, and I've recorded many a Basi Legani Mamer on my trips to Florida Yutas Kislev. I completed Basi Legani. I gave 4 classes on Basi Legani Tafshin Chavhei. I recorded them, I edited them, I already posted them, Baruch Hashem. But I'm doing something which I've never done before, which is to re-record. I have classes on Basi Legani Tafshin Memhei, which I gave in 770. And it's 3 Maimorim. There's a Basi Legani Mamer, then there's a Hemshech to it, Abba Rosh Hashanah Meim, which was said in Chamisha Asar B'Shvat, and then the Mamer Vayishma Yisrei, which I guess is 2 Shabbos later. I have all those classes up. I made the decision to re-record these classes because those Maimorim, as I remember teaching them to the ladies, I skimmed over the hardest parts of those Maimorim. 40 years ago this year, Yud Shvat, I think it was a Thursday, but the Rebbe did not fabring on Yud Shvat, he fabring Shabbos. The fabringen of Yud Shvat, if I remember correctly, was Shabbos. That was the very beginning of the Rebbe pushing off big fabringens to Shabbos. I may be wrong, but that's how I recall. I was still in yeshiva, I had not yet gone on Shlichus. I was in Olateda. I was still in Gan Eden. I was not yet in El Mazeh. And the Rebbe spoke the Mamer, Basi Legani, and he spoke about the Tzimtzumim before the Tzimtzumim. And Vayanu Amisasipim. I was 19 years old. I was not even old enough to know how little I understood. You understand? I was a physically big boy, but spiritually very small. But I remember the tumult. There was writing in the Ha'oris, back and forth, and of course I wasn't writing. The Biel was writing, the Lichtingan and the Melech Tzvibel, everybody under fake names. I think Rabbi Label all the time was involved. The Gdeli HaMaskilim were trying to understand what the Rebbe was saying. The Rebbe spoke about it once, he spoke about it twice, he spoke about it 3 times in Maimonides. He also spoke about a number of sichos, including Tetzaveh, which is mentioned in the footnotes of this Maimonides, if I'm not mistaken. And the way it was explained to me by my colleague, it's hard for me to call him a colleague because he could literally be my father. Harav Chaim Shalom Dei Ber Lipsker, Rabbi Lipsker, Ber Lipsker told me that the Rebbe basically shut it down. He says he understood. People don't understand what he's talking about, and he said leave it alone. From what I understand, the Rebbe revisited this question of Tzimtzumim before Tzimtzumim on other occasions as well after that, including the Hadrin of Tafshin Memvav, which is a little bit more than a year after. I was already in California, I was on Shlichus as a Bocher, and I heard from people who know that Hadrin, that was the Shabbos that the Rebbe had a hard time walking. He davened Ma'ariv and Shachar upstairs. He came downstairs for Fabrengen, but as soon as he sat down, there was no pain. And someone who was there told me the Rebbe spoke one Sikha for 130 minutes, 2 hours and 10 minutes non-stop, the Hadrin on Rambam. But when you look in the Hadrin, which is printed in Memvav Hadrin, it's the second Hadrin. The first time we finished was Iraf Nis, and the second time we finished was Chavav Adarishon. And we started the third Machzor Chav Zayin Adar, which is Mamish, it gives you goose pimples. And the third Hadrin was Yud Shvat, think about it. But a lot of the Hadrin is not printed. So I heard from Akeidas Musmachim that a big part of that Hadrin was about the Tzimtzum of Ribuah, the Tzimtzum before Tzimtzum Rishon, and that the Rebbe worked very hard on it. The Rebbe just Magia gewesen stark. The Rebbe worked very, very hard on it. In other words, the Biel prepared it, and that was Magiat, but as was the custom, there was always a second Hagah. And when it was given into the Rebbe the second time, the Rebbe wrote a note on the margin of the already edited text. Who takes achrayus for all of this? When they printed the Hadar, they printed only half. The half about the tivuch between Shittas HaRambam and Shittas HaKabbalah, about Nimnois or Yesh Nimnois Teva Kaim, and that Hadar, I think you have the final word where we say La'achar HaTzimtzum, that Rambam is right, that everything is al pi seichel, and Lifnei HaTzimtzum, Kabbalah is right, that there's inyanim which are l'mayla min ha-seichel. It's an important Hadar. And there, even in the Sefer HaSichos, in the Mugad HaSichos, a number of occasions where you see little notes where the Rebbe refers to this business of Tzimtzumim before the Tzimtzum Rishon. When I taught this to the women in 770, I don't know how many years ago it was, but it's a while. It's more than 10 years. I taught the Mamer. And the whole business of Tzimtzum I skipped. I'll tell you why. Because the Mamer is not Tzimtzum. This Mamer is about Mesiras nefesh. This Mamer is about Da'at Tinnik. It's a gewaldige Mamer. It's a delicious Mamer. It's a beautiful Mamer, as I'm going to explain momentarily. The Tzimtzum is, from a perspective of Haskalah, it's dominant. In other words, smart people like to learn esoterica, love this kind of a Mamer. But if you really want to be honest about the chassidus of this Mamer, the Irke chassidus of this Mamer is not about Tzimtzum Rishon, it's about Tzeves Hashem and about Mesiras nefesh and about Lada'at Tinnik. As you'll see in Mitzvah Hashem as we learn. And the Tzimtzum shtickle is a B'derech Hagav. It's a half a Mamer. It starts on page Reish Yud Ches and it goes till page Reish Chof. So because I didn't teach the Tzimtzum part, I decided to reteach all 3 Maimorim. And I Baruch Hashem, I was on an airplane all day today, so I learned all 3 Maimorim. Abba Rosh Hashanah, the Maimer of Chamishas B'Shvat has a substantial shtickle on Tzimtzum. The Maimer Yisrael has mamish very little on Tzimtzum. And I'm not sure exactly whether I want to reteach all of those Maimorim or just teach the Tzimtzum shtikalach and put them in their respective folders where they belong so that people can follow along if they wish. But this Maimer I'm teaching in its entirety. And because I'm teaching this Mamer in its entirety, this shir has nothing to do with Tzimtzum. I'm teaching the beginning and the end. In other words, I'm not learning in order. I'm learning pages, Reish Chof Tezayin, Yudzayin, the top of Reish Ches, then we're going to do a little shtikela on Reish Chof, and then we're going to read most of Reish Chof Aleph, which is the beginning and the end of the Mamer. And I want to say this to you. People say, a lot of people say, that in the early years of the Rebbe's Nesias, the Maimorim were longer, they were more scholarly, there was so much more meat and potatoes. In the later Maimorim, that was more cryptic, was harder to understand. That is true, it was harder to understand. And he was much shorter, and he didn't explain things as well, and so on. By the time I was a Bach, the Maimorim were literally 5 minutes, tiny Maimorim. And there's sort of an attitude that the Rebbe was giving less. I think that that's not true. I don't think Bechlal by a Rebbe there's such a thing as a Tofel. The Rebbe never does anything without 100%. The Rebbe made it look. When the Rebbe said Maimorim in my years, it looked like Mamish. The Rebbe spoke the Maimir, but the tone was so monotonous. He could say the deepest in Yonim and the plainest voice. But by a Rebbe, it is not shaykh. It's not possible that something should be done without 100% investment and deliberation. And I've heard this from my mashpiyim, I'm not making this up completely, that the earlier Maimorim are longer and more comprehensive, all true, but there's two things you have to understand. Number one, the Maimorim are not yet printed. So when the Rebbe said a Maimer, there was no way for us to learn that Maimer other than in the Rebbe's version, so the Rebbe had to say the whole Maimer. In the later years, the Rebbe would actually say, if you do him, whatever, it's a Lakota Teira and Teres Chaim and an Eira Teira, the Maimorim started to come out. And the Rebbe was saying Maimorim, which we had already. The sources of the Maimorim that the Rebbe was saying we had already. Which is the first reason the Maimorim in the later years got shorter, besides for the fact that the Rebbe had so many more things to say, and so many more people to be involved with. Pashat was saying shorter Maimorim because the Maimer we have, he's saying is Chiddush. So look it up. Don't be lazy. The Rebbe, whenever the Rebbe spoke Chassidus, it always began with Yadua. Now who knew? Who knew the whole Chassidus? Who's Yadua? Yaduim. That's number one. Then there's a number two. And the number two is that my Maimorim of the later years may not be as Rebbe Rashabish, if you will, in terms of their structure, in terms of their scholar, and if I'm going to use this word, in their Rundkeit, their Keilichtigkeit, how beautiful they were. But the later Maimorim are the Rebbe's. The later Maimorim are not the Rebbe repeating a Maimon from an earlier Rebbe and making a tweak, or 2 tweaks, or 3 tweaks. It's the Rebbe's Maimorim. In the short Maimorim of the Rebbe, you have more Chedushim in the later years than you do in the longer Maimorim in the early years. And I've dedicated, I don't know, last 15 years, I don't know how many years I'm doing this. It's a very long time that we've been doing the Rebbe's Maimorim. Right? We did every Maimer from Memches, Memtes backwards, and the Aleph backwards. We're holding Lamed Gimel. And every Maimer of Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel, Del Tezvav, and I hope to finish this year, but Hashem's of Tezayin. I've learned a big percentage of the Rebbe's Maimorim. And the early Maimorim were involved. You know, from a Haskalah point of view, they're more exciting. But it's not nearly as much Chiddush. It's the same Maimorim, the early Rabbeim. Same as Shalom. In the later Maimorim, the Rebbe says a lot of very original things and very radical things, very deep things, very powerful things. And just juxtaposing the Mamer Basi Legani Tafshin Chofhei to the Mamer Basi Legani Tafshin Memhei is a clear example of what I'm trying to describe. You know the story of Basi Legani. Okay, now first I'm going to digress. Okay, let me talk about Basi Legani first, and I'll get back to my point afterwards. Okay. Basi Legani is the Maimai de Friedrich Rebbe Gehat Leim Hayilula Shalei. Right, officially it was given out for the yardsets of his grandmother and his mother, and then when the Rebbe Rayatz was nostalgic, it became revealed Lemafreya that this was the Maimer of Istalkus. And the Rebbe said that this is not the Maimer of Istalkus, but it's the Tzavo of the Rebbe, the Shver of the Friedrich Rebbe. In this Maimer, you have a Rob Achayim for alle in Yonav Negeh Nun Zedor, Der Shvi. And of course, the Rebbe, every year on Yud Shvat, would say a Maimer Basi Legani, and he would explain one Perek. The first 20 years, Tafshin Yinav till Tafshin Lamed, the Rebbe did that in what looks to be quite an orderly fashion. He would take a Perek of the Friedrich of his mind. He would, of course, introduce it from the beginning. He would summarize from the beginning till which Perek we're holding, like, for example, this year's Perek Tezvav. And then he would delve into that Perek point by point in order. Starting from the beginning of the Perek, going through till the end of the Perek, he would explain it sequentially in order, and he would develop what the Friedrich Rebbe is saying. And of course, one of the undertones was that he would include from all the Rabbeim, from the Baal Shem Tov, from the Bezitcher Maggid, from the Alter Rebbe, from the Mittel Rebbe, from the Tzemach Tzedek, from the Rebbe Marash, and from the Rebbe Rashab. Tafshel Lamed Aleph, he started again. But when he started again, he didn't necessarily explain the Maimah of the Friedrich Rebbe point by point. In other words, each Perek, he would just choose one point of the Perek and focus on it. And it's very clear when you look at the Maimah of Tafshin Chafhei versus Memhei, you see that Tafshin Chafhei goes to the Maimah point by point, and Tafshin Memhei, he just speaks to the Perek Beklolos as a whole, as you'll see later on. And of course, the story of Basi Legani has 2 points. Number one, the mission, and the mission is to make a didali esbarach b'tachtenim v'osu l'mikdash v'shchanti b'teicham. Tzadikim mishu oris mishkinu l'ado leha. Basi Legani acheisi kala. That you have to bring the Eibush back down into this world, and that this is done on the eskafia v'eshapche. And he gave 3 examples for this eskafia and this hapche, karbones, and being enshtos the kedusha, and hafichas sheket tekeresh. That's the first half of Basi Legani. The second half of Basi Legani is who does it, who makes the didali esbarach, who brings Mashiach. And of course, the answer is Mashiach is brought by the Tzivos Hashem. And Tzivos Hashem means the foot soldiers. That means Chassidim. And he explains that a melech has a very strong keich hanetzach. By a king, the midas hanetzachim is stronger than by anybody else. And when a king fights a melchamas nitzachin, he pulls out all the stops. First of all, machnis atzmi v'tachsisi melchama. He puts himself into the tactics of war. He doesn't trust his general; he does it himself. Second of all, if he dispenses of the treasure which has been collected by him and his ancestors, painstakingly and hidden away because of their preciousness, and he gives them away recklessly. He gives them, like it says in the Mamer, to the pkidei achal, to the generals, but he gives it for the sake of the anshe chal poshat, for the foot soldiers, which is us. And the third thing is mashle chayv v'negav. He gives away his own life. Of these 3 points, the Friedrich Rebbe focuses on the middle one. Perek Yud Beis of Basi Legani begins with the words Lahaven inyan ha'oitzer l'mayil, to understand the Eibish's treasure. And this discussion of treasure goes on for 5 or 6 parakim, from Yud Beis at least till Yud Zayin. To explain ha'oitzer shel mayla, the Rebbe goes into Tikkun Zayar, and in Seif l'mayla din kates l'mata din tachlis, godliness is not known by anybody because it's higher than the highest world. And godliness is known by everybody because it's lower than the lowest world. And that composite, those 2 characteristics, summarize what godliness is. Everybody knows it, and no one has a clue what it is. And I think you can say the same thing about Chassidus. Everybody knows it, no one knows what it is. And in 3 parakim, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel, Yud Dalet, he explains the idea that you can find godliness even in the most quote-unquote God-forsaken places. Right. Perek Tezvav, which is the Perek of this year, begins the discussion of Lamay Adein Kates. And of course, the Rebbe points out that the Friedrich Rebbe reverses the order of the Tikkun Zayar. The Tikkun Zayar says first, Lamay Adein Kates, Lamata Adein Tachlis. And the Friedrich Rebbe explains it backwards. First, Lamata Adein Tachlis, and then Lamay Adein Kates. And the Rebbe explains why the Friedrich Rebbe does this. Because in order to understand what it means, Lamayla, you have to first understand Lamata. Lamata is considered the lower level. And as the Rebbe pointed out in the Mamer of Tafshin Chavhei very emphatically, Lamayla Adein Kates, that's the Yotzer. The removal of godness, this is the Yotzer. Okay? When you learn the Friedrich Rebbe's Maimon, the way I understand it, and you remember, Shkiyas mi Yovan, I am a teacher, and if you're listening to me, I don't know how to say this respectfully, that makes me your teacher. There are 2 parakim that deal with Erin Seif, Lamayla Den Kates, Perek Tazav and Perek Tazayin. And they're very different. Because in Perek Tazav, the Friedrich Rebbe says, Lamayla Den Kates means, Ubeklolos Uwinyan Tzimtzum. Lamayla Den Kates means the idea that Hashem hides in order to create the world. In other words, Erin Seif, Lamayla Den Kates is not describing a Madrig and Erin Seif. It's describing a degree of concealment. Lamayla Den Kates means Hashem is hidden. We don't see him. And in the previous Rebbe's Perek Tezvav, he explains the process of Tzimtzum. And of course, our Rebbe, the Rebbe Zagazunzai, develops this beautifully. going through all the Rabbeim, from the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid and the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe and Tzedek. He goes in order in that Mamer. The Marash Rebbe Rashab, and develops our understanding of Tzimtzumim. But he also explains two things. Number one, the purpose of Tzimtzum is Gilui, and the pnimius of Tzimtzum is Elokos, Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshutei. And number two, that Lapoil we see darkness. And the darkness that we see comes from a koyach. Like it says in Shari'ichet Ve'emunah, hein hein gvuraisav. Just like it takes infinite power to reveal chesed, it takes an infinite power to hide. And that's a very, very, very brief summary of the Mamer of Tafshin Chof Hei. Perek Tezayin, which we're going to learn Lineda with Hashem's help next year, is the new Inyan. And the Perek Tezayin is going to explain that in Sefer Lamalad and Kates doesn't mean that godliness is hidden because of Tzimtzum. It means the level of godliness which is above revelation. In other words, there's two concepts in Sefer Lamalad and Kates. The first concept is the power of Sefer Lamalad and Kates. That Tzimtzum requires a power of Lamayla Mailad and Kates. And number two, the level of Lamayla Mailad and Kates. There's a level of godliness that's called Lamayla Mailad and Kates. And the level of godliness which is called Lamayla Mailad and Kates is Atzmas of Elokus. But on the Friedrich Rebbe's Maimah, these two ideas are in two different prakim. The power of Lamayla Mailad and Kates to create Tzimtzumim is in Perek Tezvav, and the level of godliness which is connected to concealment is in Perek Tezayin. So when you learn the Maimah of Tafshin Chof Hei, the Rebbe talks about Tzimtzum. He doesn't talk about the second idea at all. And when you learn the Maimah of Tafshin Mem Hei, it's the same thing. There's three Maimorim in a Hemshech, in Basi, Legani, and in Asara, and in Abara Shoshanim. And both of these Maimorim, and in Seif Lamayla Maila Adin Kates, means the Koyach of Eibusha to make Tzimtzumim. It's only that here the Rebbe is going to add a higher inyanim of Tzimtzum than you have in the Maimah of Basi, Legani, Tafshin Yud, and Tafshin Chof Hei. But when the Rebbe gets to Yisrei, which is the third Maimah in this Hemshech, and again, I've learned all three Maimah Be'ezer Hashem, but I have not decided how to teach them yet. In the Maimah of Yisrei, Mem Hei, the Rebbe already mentions the idea of in Sefer Malabad and Kates not meaning the koyach for Tzimtzum, but the atmos of Elokus, the madrega of Elokus, which is Cheshach. In other words, in the third Maimah of this Hemshech, the Rebbe mentioned the Tafshin Mem Hei, the Inyan which is Negea to Perek Tezayin, which is going to be next year, Tafshin Mem Vov and Tafshin Pei Vov, Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach V'Yazala. This is what's going on. But when you look at the two Maimorim, now I'm going back to my point. Tafshin Chof Hei was 11 pages long. I used a different anocha, so maybe in this anocha it's 10 pages long. Tafshin Mem Hei, 6 pages long. Tafshin Chof Hei has a relatively short introduction and a lengthy discussion on Tzimtzumim. This Perek, more than half the Maimah is prefix and suffix. Just the middle is about Tzimtzumim. But the truth of the matter is, if you're honest, in other words, if you get back your Haskalah bias, that you like fancy Kabbalah stuff, this Maimah is a far deep Maimah than the Chof Hei Maimah. The Rebbe says incredibly important new ideas. If you had to summarize the Maimah of Tafshin Mem Hei, even though you ask any person who remembers the Rebbe saying them, they're really going to jump on the fact that the Rebbe spoke about, quote, Tzimtzumim before Tzimtzum Arishan. This Maimah is about two things: Mesiras nefesh, that is revealed because of Tzimtzum. Fakat Mesiras nefesh is revealed because of Tzimtzum. And Ladaz Atinik, the child who touches God because he's too simple to have a sophisticated relationship with Eibishter, which is also connected to Tzimtzum. So, if you look at these Maimorim from a perspective of Chassidishkeit, of what Chassidus is about, and really what Avodah is about, and what the Rebbe is about, not the Rebbe as a thinker and as an intellectual, but the Rebbe as a teacher and an inspirer of direction, you could make a legitimate argument that the Maimah of Tafshin Mem Hei has much more Rebbe than Tafshin Chof Hei. Tafshin Chof Hei is according to earlier Rabbeim and developing an understanding of Tzimtzum Arishan. And Tzimtzumim are closely not Tzimtzum. This Maimah, the Rebbe talks about that also, but the Rebbe talks about what he wants to talk about, which is the Maila Mesiras Nefesh of our times. And he says Chedushim, he says a lot of things which are very controversial in terms of the classic understanding of these things. And the Inyan V'dazeh Atinik. So as I get older, and I get stupider, really, and my brain is not as sharp, and how do I say this nicely? Haskalah doesn't matter so much to me like I used to. I look at this Maimah and I say, this Maimah is Shalei Be'erech, the Maimah from 20 years earlier. Even though it's shorter and easier to learn, But the Rebbe is not speaking lomdus, the Rebbe is speaking life. And the life that the Rebbe is speaking in this Mamer is far, far more powerful than the life that he spoke about 20 years before, which is today 60 years before, Tov Shin Chofei. So that's my introduction to this Mamer, that we're learning another Basi Legani, which I don't normally do. And they were holding Perek Tezvav. And Perek Tezvav is the beginning of discussion in Seif L'mayla Mayla Dein Kates. The aspect of Ein Seif, which is about nobody knows him. And the explanation is in the Maimid Lashon, the Frierdiker Rebbe, in his Maimid, the Beklal is who, Tzimtzum. In general, it's the concept of Tzimtzum. And the Rebbe will talk about that. And the deeper in Ein Seif L'mayla Dein Kates, which is not Beklal is who, Tzimtzum, but the Elokus of Chayshach, that the level of godliness which is higher than Gilui. And you have a Lashon in the Maimid of Yisrei, I think, where the Rebbe says there's such a deep level of darkness that it's even higher than the idea of Ein Seif L'mayla Dein Kates. The whole slug is Ein Seif L'mayla Dein Kates, and the Rebbe says L'mayla Dein Kates you get to such a deep madrega of Yoshes Chayshach Sistrei that you reach a madrega b'lakus, which is so beseiser, so choshech that it's even higher than the L'mayla Dein Kates. The Rebbe is going to say that in the third Maimid, and I'm really hoping and planning to teach all of this Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach in short order. I'm hoping. Before Chanukah, I hope, to finish this sugya, and then to go back to Tafshin Lamed Gimel, which is what we're holding. I just want to say one short thing. In this Maimir, the Rebbe mentions all the Rabbeim, beginning with the Alter Rebbe. He doesn't mention the Baal Shem Tov, he doesn't mention the Mesiras Magid. And he mentioned them all in order except for the Alter Rebbe. He starts with the Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, Reb Marash, Rebbe Rashab, and the very end of the Maimir he mentions the Alter Rebbe. The Baal Shem Tov and the Magid are missing, and it's disturbing. But in the Maimir of Abba Rosh Hashanah Meim, which the Rebbe said a few days later, this was Shabbos B'Shalach Yirah of Shvat. So Yud Shvat was Friday. So Chamisha also B'Shvat was Tuesday or Wednesday, Tuesday night, which is a Hemshech to this Maimir. And in that Maimir, the Rebbe made it a point to mention the Baal Shem Tov and the Mesiras Magid. And when we get to that Maimir, I will show you that the way he mentions the Baal Shem Tov and the Mesiras Magid in this Maimir from Tafshin Mem Hey is quite different than the way he mentioned the Baal Shem Tov and the Mesiras Magid in Tafshin Chav Hey. The shayla is how much time I'm going to have and how much koyach I'm going to have to explore those differences, because it's not as a negeh. So Rabbi said, after all of my talking, I'm talking almost half an hour, I'm going to start learning the Maimir. Today we're learning the beginning and the end, which is the chassidische part of the Maimir. It's not the lomdische part of the Maimir. The lomdische part of the Maimir is about Tzimtzumim. I'm hoping to do that tomorrow sometime. Adei b'shtalfen. Today I want to talk about the beginning and the end. It's a Basi Legani. All Basi Leganis are the same. Right? Yossi was here, he left, and he came back. But his coming back is limited to a house, and therefore becomes our task to expand that house to include the entire world. But the Rebbe is going to focus on the Mesiras nefesh. He's going to focus on the Mesiras nefesh. And he's going to say, after a few times he mentioned Mesiras nefesh, that this is the of Eitzer Sheyireh Shamayim. The Oiter is the Mesiras nefesh. And if you read between the lines, he's going to say that the Koyach HaMesiras nefesh comes out because of Tzimtzum. When it's darker and darker and even darker, Ein Seif L'mayla Dein Kates means godliness is so deeply hidden that it calls out the Koyach HaMesiras nefesh of Yidden. So the byproduct of the Ein Seif L'mayla Dein Kates, or to say it in other words, the avoida of Ein Seif L'mayla of godliness being hidden is in Mesiras nefesh. But like I told you before, and it's going to be in today's shir, I'm planning to do this together, the beginning and the end. There are two big ideas that come out of Hashem's hiddenness, of the Tzimtzum, Ein Seif L'mayla Dein Kates. Number one, the Mesiras nefesh, and number two, the simple child who talks to the Eibishter like a child because he's not smart enough to have a fancy relationship with the Eibishter. So without any further ado, let us begin. It begins the Rebbe Basi Legani Achesi Kala. Hashem says, I've come back to my shelter, to my garden, my sister, my bride. It doesn't say Legan, which means I came to a garden. It says Legani, to my garden. That means he was here already and he came back. Or maybe and the Rebbe brings in his Mamer, which he published for what turned out to be Yom HaElul Shalai. The day of his Istalkus Hilul, his passing in his Aliyah. B'shnas Hashem Yisbarach, it's not Tavshin Yud. That's my Medrash Rabbi B'mkei, the Medrash Rabbi in the place of Basi Legani. That it says Legani, Legnuni. Legani means my shelter, but it doesn't say a shelter. It says my shelter, and the Medrash translates this to mean L'mokim Shahoya Ikri B'tchila. Hashem was here, and Kvayachal he left, and Basi doesn't mean he's coming to the garden. He's coming back to the garden. L'mokim Shahoya Ikri B'tchila is here already. Because the Yibsh created the world, since this world was the purpose of creation. The core of what Shechina is was found in Tachtainim. Whatever Shechina means, there's some places it says it's the highest Madrega in Shechina, and some places it means Mamesh Atzmos. But then, then there were negative actions, beginning with Adam Marishan. Also, the Shechina departed from earth to heaven, and from one heaven to the next, until the seventh heaven. Then comes Avin Tzaddik, beginning with Avraham Avinu. And they did good deeds, which is the opposite of Maisim Loitev. And Arid was Shechina Merakia Zayin B'chol. They brought the Shechina back down from the seventh heaven to the sixth heaven, and from the sixth heaven to the fifth heaven, and so forth. Meisha Rabbeinu is the seventh. And all sevens are beloved. And notice that it's not in Segraim, it's in the Pnim of the Mamer. He brought the Shechina back down to this earth. And the Rebbe points out that although Moshe Rabbeinu didn't bring the Shechina from the highest Rakia, but Faket from the Rakia closest to earth, and he brought it down to earth, when we attribute to Moshe Rabbeinu the endeavor of bringing the Shechina back down to the earth, we say he brought it down from heaven to earth, from all the heavens. From the whole notion of the skies. So although he's bringing it down from one Rakia to Oretz, it's the concept of the Teda not being able to, the Shechina, not being able to be on the lowest level, and Moshe remedies that. El HaOretz to the earth, like the Rebbe said in the Basi Legani of Tafshin Yad Aleph, that Adam Rishon is the first Chayte, he's the Iker, because that's when the Shechina leaves. And that's why Moshe, who's the last Mitaken, is the most important, because it brings it back down to earth. So all the six heavens, or the seven heavens, they attack at different levels. But Hatzad Sheva Kulam, they're Rakia. Hatzad Sheva Kulam is saying that the presence of Shechina is limited to how low it can come down. Moshe brought down the Oretz means that there's no limit how low Shechina can come down. That's a perfect healing, a complete healing of the ills of the Chatoim. So that's a story. Hashem was here, we kicked him out, and then we slowly brought him back. We, the Tzaddikim, brought him back until Moshe Rabbeinu brought him back down into earth. What about the issue of Maida Hava Hava? Since when are we in the business of telling stories? Why do we have to know what happened a long time ago? And of course the answer is because that's only the beginning. So this is the job of Tzaddikim. That not just these seven Tzaddikim brought the Shechina back down to the earth, and that's it. These seven Tzaddikim brought the Shechina back down to the earth, but that's only the beginning. Because they brought him down to the earth only in the Beis HaMikdash. And our task is to expand that Beis HaMikdash until it encompasses the entire world. Like it says in the Pasuk. And I want to say before I go, that in Tov Shin Chof Ches, which is a Mugadik Basi Legani, the Rebbe brings out that both of these Psukim, and Tzadikim Yishu Ares V'Yishkin Al Adaleha, are in this Medrash, and Shir Hashirim and Basi Legani. And the reason you have two Psukim, because one Pasuk talks about building the Beis HaMikdash, and the second part, it talks about doing the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash once it's built. And the way the Rebbe explains it, the pasuk that talks about building the Beis HaMikdash is the pasuk V'aseh l'mikdash v'shachanti b'seichom. And the pasuk that talks about doing the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash is Tzadikim Yishu Aretz V'Yishkun Al Adaleha. And if I remember correctly, he says real Tzadikim, like Avis Ha'elam, Avraham, Moshe Rabbeinu, they build the Beis HaMikdash. And Amech Kolom Tzadikim, proverbial Tzadikim, the idea that every Yid is a Tzadik, does the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. So Al Pi Svara, Al Pi Seichel, Al Pi Seder, first you have to say V'asu l'mikdash v'shachanti b'teicham v'dei tzadikim kipshutei, and then tzadikim yirshu aretz, because yishkinu la'ad aleha, they bring Sheikh and Admar b'kadosh to be made l'mata ba'aretz, so it's ayidei v'amech cholam tzadikim. But in both this Mamer and in Chav Hey, he brings the second pasuk first. And he says, the work of tzaddikim in general. And you'll see in a minute. This means all of us, that tzaddikim, yeshu ore, tzaddikim inherit elam haba. Why? Because yishkin ul ad aleha, they bring sheikh and ad mad v'kadosh, the Eibishter, who's removed, that is called ad into the lowest worlds. This task is on each one of us. Because tzaddikim, when it says in this pasuk tzaddikim, it means every single yid who's called a tzaddik. And all of us have this contiguous, this singular, this unified, this shared mission of להמשיך to bring the Shechina down. It's called Shechina, like it says in the Mamer, Perek Nebeis in Tanya. He's metaying to Perek Mem Aleph. The Shechina is Perek Nebeis. I don't know why he's not in an Aleph. It rests and it manifests in the lowest world, like it says in Tanya, in the lowest world. So this goes on all of us. All Yidden together throughout history share this one mission, to bring the Shechina back down into this world. And then he brings the other pasuk. Where do all Yidden get the koyach to do the aved of tzaddikim yishu oris v'yishkinu ulad aleha? The answer is Mesiras Rabbeinu, and for him it says the other pasuk. That Mesiras Rabbeinu was him, Shechaz Shechina L'mata B'Oretz. Mesiras brought the Shechina back down into the world. First of all, by Matan Torah, and second of all, by Binyan HaMishkan. If I'm not wrong, and I'm guessing, but I'm saying nevertheless that Mesiras Rabbeinu builds the Beis HaMikdash, and that's the pasuk v'asur l'mikdash v'shechanti b'soicham. We bring karbones and mahapech shtos the umazet shtos the kedusha and the sheker of this world to kedesh and keshev ad meibishten in that Beis HaMikdash. So his job comes first. And our job comes second in that Beis HaMikdash. The Rebbe says our job first because our job is the end of it, is the point of it all. And we do it with the koyach of Mesiras Rabbeinu, who's part of that job, which is the first pasuk of Asur L'mikdash b'shechanti b'seich. But he breaks it up. The idea that Moshe starts it. And that's the pasuk of Asur L'mikdash b'shechanti b'seich. And the rest of us complete it. And that's the pasuk that Dikim Yishu Aretz. Yishkinu Ad Aleha has many details. First of all, Mesiras Rabbeinu Agashmi. One man who lived a long time ago, he does the Aveda of Asur L'mikdash. And number two, Al Derach Zanim Shabameshe Bechol Dara V'Dara. In every generation is a Rebbe Nasi B'Yisrael. And he's the Spashtusa, the Meshe Bechol Dara V'Dara. Like the Rebbe brings, Ein Deish, Ein Beik Mesiras Rabbeinu, Mordechai B'Deidei, Mesiras B'Deidei, and so on. And in each generation, the Rebbe, the Nasi Adar, brings the Shechina back down into the world as far as the Beis HaMikdash is concerned. And number three, Shazeh Nimshach B'Chol Echad V'Echad. The third level is that inside every yid you have Mesiras Rabbeinu, like it says in Tanya Perek Mem Beis. In V'ati Yisrael Mo'ad Hashem Alakech Hashem Imach Kiyim L'Yira Atu Yira Milsa Zutra Sehi. In L'Gabi Mesha Milsa Zutra Sehi. So the first level is Mesiras Rabbeinu Agashmi. Second level is Pashtus of the Mesiras B'Chol Dara V'Dara. The third level is the Mesiras B'Chol Echad V'Echad. And the fourth level is Pashat. Every yid is himself Mesiras Rabbeinu. This is every yid, not just because of the bechin of Meshirim. Just as he is a Jew, has the same mission. That a yid has to make this world into a Beis HaMikdash and a Diru le'yizbarach b'tachtein. How? We have from Mesiras Rabbeinu a koyach, from Mesiras Rabbeinu a gashmi, from the Mesiras Rabbeinu sh'chol dara v'dara, from the Mesiras Rabbeinu sh'chol echad v'echad miyisrael, until the madrego sh'chol echad v'echad miyisrael v'pashtus, we have a koyach from Mesiras Rabbeinu for Yiras Shamayim. Like it says in Tanya Perek Mem Beis. Since when is Yira easy? The Gemara asks the question. And the Alter Rebbe Perek Yitzayin brings the Kosh Kenav is even harder. And the Gemara answers because of Mesiras Rabbeinu it's easy. What about the fact that I'm not Mesiras Rabbeinu, I'm Yosel Shlob? So he answers that there's a Bechin of Das. Mesiras Rabbeinu is in the Neshama Klaus, and he's the Klal of Kol HaRoyim, and he puts Das into each one of us, and therefore what's easy for Mesiras Rabbeinu, every year there's a Shaykhis to. But I want to point out that this mention of Yiras Shamayim, which in a few lines later is going to turn into the Aveda of Mesiras nefesh, is deeply connected to the theme of Basi Legani, because Basi Legani is about Oitzer, that Hashem gives treasure. And what does treasure mean? He gives out his hidden secret, his hidden treasure, he gives it away to the people. So the Frierdiker Rebbe talks about the treasure and explains about Pikabala that it goes in Erin Sefer L'Mayla Dein Kates. But the Rebbe adds in many of his Maimonim that this Oitzer is the Oitzer of Yiras Shamayim. So when it says over here that everybody has a koyach for Moshe Rabbeinu to make a deal in some way, that's already a reference to the Eitzer and the Bizbuz Eitzer, although the Rebbe doesn't say it straight out, but it's connected. And he continues, that Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu to tell Yidden, Yisrael, and now Jewish people, what does the Eibush expect of you? The only thing expected of you is to have Yiddas Hashem. And the Gemara asks, is Yira a milsa zutra? Yira easy, and the Gemara answers the Gabi Moshe. Hainu she Yira a milsa zutra. Yira is a small thing. The Gabi kol echad ve'echad Yisrael, to every single Jew. Now the Rebbe knows quite well how difficult it is to have Yira Shamayim, yeah. But nevertheless he says it because the Gemara says it. Now the Rebbe brings it in Tanya. We have a keich from the Rebbe, we have a keich from Moshe Rabbeinu for this Yira Shamayim, which l'chayda is the Eitzer Ha'elyum, which is connected to Mesiras nefesh. And I just want to throw this in. That wir sind doch lernen von Rambam. Das ist doch unser ganzer Chayes, right? We have a shaykhs to the Rebbe. And the greatest thing we can do for ourselves is Ratzon Rebbe, L'zakis, Es Chasidav, L'fir, Hibbel, Teru, Mitzvahs. Every time we do something that the Rebbe tells us to do, we're Mekusha to the Rebbe. I heard my younger man that when the Rebbe made the Takon of Rambam, he asked Reb Mendel Futterfas if he should learn one Perek or 3 Prokim. And Reb Mendel said he should learn 1 Perek and 3 Prokim and Sefer HaMitzvahs. So he told the Rebbe, he told us Mashpi, he told Reb Mendel Futterfas, the Rebbe didn't give such a tzor. And Reb Mendel told him, was verstehst du nicht? 3 Wegen, wie man kann sich verbinden mit dem Rebbe. What don't you understand? These are 3 ways that allow you to become attached to the Rebbe, the Nasi Ador. Unser Rebbe, the Rebbe is unser. So there's a Sipur Mufla, which happened tonight, just a few years ago. How many years ago? 252 years ago to be exact. 252 years ago to be exact. You had kissed of Tov Kuf Lamed Gimel, yeah? And Tov Shin Pei Gimel would have been 250. Now it's Tov Shin Pei Hey. To 250 years ago, Reishon and Beis, the Mezritcher Maggid was nostalgic. Yutas Kislev. And as we know, the Mezritcher Maggid said on his deathbed to the Alter Rebbe, Yutas Kislev is unzer hilula. It's connected to both of us. And the Rebbe brings this in his sichos and in his letters, and he also mentions the Shas Teshuvos Min HaShamayim. That makes reference to the fact that in the Zman HaRishonim, Min HaShamayim, they wrote, Hayem Yem Shlishi Yutas Kislev Hu Yem Beseira. So the Mezritcher Maggid's tzava was not written, it was spoken. The Chavaraya Kadisha were present, and they all notarized it, they all endorsed it, they all testified that it was true. In the tzava, he speaks to each one separately. But the bulk of it is he's speaking to his own son. And one of the things that tzava is, Til meid Rambam b'chol yem, mepnei shu zgula l'yireh shamayim. The Rebbe, the Mezritcher Maggid told his son the Malach, who was Isha L'kim, who was a Malach. Learn Rambam every day because it's a school of Yireh Shamayim. The Rebbe never once mentioned that. The Rebbe made that kind of limit that Rambam never mentioned this. But you think the Rebbe didn't know that the Rambam is a school of Yireh Shamayim? And maybe Rambam is not only a school for Yireh Shamayim, but the Rambam is itself the Oitzet. The Oitzet, the Bizbus Oitzet, which gives the Yireh Shamayim. Yireh, he mills the Zutra Selagab, Kolechad Vechad Yisrael. Yireh Hashem is easy for every Jew. Which is why it's the task of every Jew. La says Mishkan Mikdash to make a seat on which Alakus will sit, and on that basis will be an environment which is holy, on which Alakus will then hover in the Madreg of Kedusha, which is hard in the Madreg of Shechina. To such an extent do we build Eibush to a home, a Mishkan and a Mikdash. But the Shechanti B'teicham is not just one place, but B'teicham Lechad V'echad Yisrael, our home, our body, our life becomes a Shechina, a Mishkan and a Mikdash for the Eibush Shechina and Kedusha. We can all do it because we all have a koyach of Moshe Rabbeinu. And again, if I'm understanding it correctly, the koyach of Moshe Rabbeinu was connected to the pasuk v'asul Mikdash Shechanti B'teicham, which is about building the Beis HaMikdash. And with that koyach, we all expand that Beis HaMikdash, and that's connected to the pasuk. Tzadikim Yishu Aretz v'yishkinu la'ad aleha. And we have koyches from Moshe Rabbeinu to do this because nitzutz of Moshe Rabbeinu was in every single yid. And the language of the Basi Legani, there's a bizbus ha'etzis, which gives us this Yiddish Shamayim. And he continues, Ubeprati in specific, Avodah Zohi, the way this Avodah is done. How do you make Eibush to the Beis HaMikdash? Or Mishkan and a Mikdash? The answer is Chapcha. It's Chapcha HaSheikh and that transforming darkness to light. And you have to see, this is a built-in Mugadik HaMaimi. And the Rebbe spoke, and they wrote it down. But the Kedesh Nakdam of Teda Shalom, they cared about every word that came out of the Rebbe's mouth and they wrote it correctly. The Rebbe does not mention the Skafia, only his Hapcha. He doesn't mention the Skafia till the last line to the Mamer Mamish on page Reish Chaf Aleph. In this Mamer he speaks only of his Hapcha. Now if we were Lomdim and Go'oinim and Chassidim, we would study why in this Basi Legani focuses on his Hapcha more than his Skafia, even though it says in some of the Maimorim, the latest Maimorim Basi Legani, that his Skafia has a mile over his Hapcha. But this Maimon doesn't speak his Skafia, it just speaks his Hapcha. The Avodah of Yidden transform Klipa into Kedusha, with the Koyach from the Eitzah of Yerushalayim, which we have, and to make a Didel Yisbarach B'tachteinim in our own homes, in our own bodies, in our own lives. Hafi Chaz Cheshech Shebe'elam Le'er, transforming the darkness of the world to light, which is Mashalei Chemes HaShekesh Shebe'elam. We take the false, the fallacy of the world, which is Elam, Lashon, Helam, Vehester, which is the Inshal Sheker. Boards for the Beis HaMikdash, like it says in the Pasuk, Asisa Kroshim La Mishkan Atzishitim Eimdim, that Sheker is AC is Kedesh. Sheker, which means a lie, is the same letters as the word Kedesh, which means a board. Umahabchem es HaSheker, transformed the lie of Elam Hazeh to a Kesher, and a Kesher and a Kedesh, which is Kroshim La Mishkan, Lasses Bei Mishkan Leis Barach B'tachtei. So avoid of transforming Klipa to Kedusha, with the help of the Yerushalayim, which we inherited from Moshe Rabbeinu, which I am calling Oitzer, even though the Rebbe doesn't say that, allows us that we should make our part of the Dira B'Tachtein. So Basi Legani is not just a story, it's a mandate. And the mandate is that we need to do what Moshe Rabbeinu began, to make this whole world, including our own bodies and our own wealth and our own lives, into a Mishkan and Mikdash LaYizbarach. And then the Rebbe says, V'hine avei dezu, the Bnei Yisrael, this work, transform the lie of this world into a Kedesh and a Kesher Mishkan, is connected to Mesiras nefesh. This doesn't say in Basi Legani Tafshin Yud. It doesn't. It doesn't say in Basi Legani Tafshin Chaf Hei either. It says in Basi Legani Tafshin Mem. And the avodah of Yidden is Mesiras nefesh. And this concept of Mesiras nefesh is connected to Tzivos Hashem, as you'll see in a minute. And this concept of Mesiras nefesh adds to the Basi Legani a dimension which is l'chayra higher than what you have in the earlier Maimorim. That Yidden and making the Didlis Bara Patachtenim have Mesiras nefesh. They give away everything. In the language of the Rebbe Rashab called the Yetzel Mechamed's Beis David, get Kiz's case of L'ishtei. Mesiras nefesh. And of course Mesiras nefesh can be in a way of Mesiras Haratzon, which is called Mesiras nefesh B'koyach. And it could be Mesiras nefesh Kipshutei, Mamish. Alecha Eragnu Kol Hayem, like the Kodesh Tzvi ben Alexander HaKoyen, which is Mesiras nefesh al Kiddush Hashem bepeil mamish, l'kadosh shmoi v'rabim. And this avodah of Mesiras nefesh makes the dira leis barach b'tachtenim, and the koyach of that Mesiras nefesh comes from Eitzer Elyon. So I was very taken as soon as I started to prepare this Mamer. Remember, I learned this Mamer years ago. I taught this Mamer years. I'm teaching it again, and I right away said the ik of this Mamer is not the Tzimtzumim, even though that's the part that everyone wants to talk about. The ik of this Mamer is not Mesiras nefesh. And the Rebbe explains why. And the Rebbe is going to say things which he's going to quote Samach Vav, but what he quotes Samach Vav simply doesn't say in Samach Vav. It says in the Kudesichas of the Sidereinu. Kishleim es avei dezu, the idea of working on his hapcha, as he called it in the previous paragraph, to make this world a home for HaKadosh Baruch, including our own bodies and wealth. He be'efen shalavdus, is to do it like a common slave. Now, a slave is not a Mesiras nefesh person. A slave is like a Paltiel person. Like it says in Samach Vav, there's a lot of kinds of neshamas, and the neshama who has the highest attachment to Hashem is the neshama of the Eved Pashut who submits. The Ben is too smart, he's close to the king. The Sad is too smart, he's close to the king. The Eved Neman is too smart, he's close to the king. The Eved Pashut is the furthest thing from the king, and in his place of simplicity, he does what the king wants by putting the king before himself. Anon is Siv Malkeh, and he has the deepest connection to the king in terms of Kabbalah Sil. But he's going to say that there's Mesiras nefesh here as well. So there's two different inyanim here. One is the inyan of Avodas Ovid, Avdus, and the other is the inyan of Mesiras nefesh. Now, in the Maimorim, when Chassidus talks about Avdus versus Mesiras nefesh, this is the distinction that they make. An Eved's distinction is Kabbalah Sel, his readiness to do what he's told without having to understand. And the degree of his Kabbalah Sel is so great Like the Lashon of the Maimorem is Tainag Eved, Tainag Adin Mamish. His Metzias becomes, his action is not attributed to him, it's attributed to his master. And if your master is the Eibishter, and you do some of the Kabbalah, your action is the action of the Eibishter, which is why, according to Chassidus, you're never closer to Hashem than when you serve him like an Eved Poshet, rather than an Eved Neman and a Ben and a Sad, as I'll mention in a moment. But one thing Eved does not have is Mesiras nefesh, and that's a Chayal, a soldier. Soldiers don't only have Kabbalah Sale, they have a readiness for Mesiras nefesh. The Rebbe here brings the two together, right? He starts off by saying that the avodah of his hapche is Mesiras nefesh, and he immediately goes back to avdos, because avdos and Mesiras nefesh, if you will, are two sides of a coin. Avdos is the idea that a person submits to Lakus to the extent that his actions are not Mesiachas to him than Mesiachas to the Eibishter, which is the ultimate level of a connection. You're never more connected to Hashem than what you do is done with such a submissiveness that it's Kol Yochel, as if it's Hashem's actions. But Mesiras nefesh is sacrifice. So let's read it. He starts off with Av. He starts the paragraph by mentioning Mesiras nefesh and immediately goes to Avdos. Kishlei Masaveidazu. The wholeness of the Aved of his hapcha is Aved the Avdos. When you serve Hashem like an Eved. And of course in the Samach Vav, in the Mikne Rav, he speaks about Eved Neman and an Eved Poshet. An Eved Neman is an Eved because of his greatness, like Eliezer Eved Avram is called an Eved Neman. Deilu Mashke Meteres Rabbi Lachedim. Eved Poshet is a simple person. Doesn't understand much, but he does what he's told. And in the Chassid, in Samach Vav, he brings that the Eved Poshet is even higher than Eved Neman. And he's certainly higher than a Sad, and he's even higher than a Ben. But here the Rebbe makes them all tzaddikim. Look what the Rebbe does. Moshe Rabbeinu shoy Eved Neman. Moshe Rabbeinu was not an Eved Poshet. He was the ultimate Eved Neman. Like it says in the davening of Shachris, Yismach Moshe Matnas Chalkik Eved Neman. But the Rebbe says, Ad shehoisa begam malas Eved Poshet. Moshe Rabbeinu was an Eved Neman. An Eved Neman means he's a servant to his master. He's the property of his master, Kikaspehu. But he understands his master. He knows Teiras Rabbi, and he's Deilu Mashke Meteres Rabbi Lachedim. The mind being involved takes away from the pshitas of the Kabbalah Sale, which is why in the Samach Vav, Eved Poshet is closer to the Eibishter than Eved Neman. So the Rebbe says Bepashtus, Achahoisa Boy Gam, Milas Eved Poshet, Moshe Rabbeinu, although he was an Eved Neman, had the mile of Eved Poshet as well. Chemavur Hemshech Ha'inyin B'Samach Vav. And I tell you, it does not say it's Samach Vav. This whole business, the Rebbe learns in the Samach Vav, Eved Poshet is greater than Eved Neman, and L'cheira Ben is greater than a Sad, and the interface between the Eved and a Ben, the whole Samach Vav, is about the question of who's closer to the Eibishter, an Eved or a Ben. And the Maskana is that if Eved is closer to the Eibishter, it's only that there's such a thing called Ben Shu Gam Kinev, Ben Nasa Eved. That's how the Samach Vav is structured. But in the Mamer of Mikne Rav, Eved Poshet is higher than Eved Neman. The Rebbe says Bepashtus that Moshe Rabbeinu was an Eved Neman with the mile of Eved Poshet. I think in the Mamer of the Rebbe, if you look carefully, it seems like the Rebbe holds that Eved Neman is higher than Eved Poshet. Samach Vav clearly says that Eved Poshet is a bigger mile because of the greater bittul. But if you look at the Mamer of the Rebbe, it's hard to say that Rebbe disagrees, but he says something different. He says the mile of Eved Neman is at least as great as the mile of Eved Poshet, which he says over here. And look at the right. The yes at Al Kain. Moreover, he's calling Bonam Levidish Hashem's children. Now, a Ben is for sure not an Eved, because the whole difference between a Ben and an Eved is a Ben serves his master from closeness, because he understands him, because he feels him, because they have the same mohus, same character, the same personality. A Eved serves his master from distance, from his batlus. If a state nicht, he doesn't understand, and he nevertheless serves. And there's a ma'ilin Eved over a Ben, and the Rebbe says no, that the Ben also has Mesiras nefesh, and he quotes the Zohar, which is quoted in the Tanya. Right? I'll give you the shtickle on this. Al pi nigle, the av of a Ben to a av, the love of a son to a father is less than the love of a father to a son. Like that ayah they bring from Mizarch Hashem Shalov, that a father would never kill his son, but a son could kill his father. That's the halacha. But in the Zohar it says exactly the opposite. The opposite of what it says in the Gemara. When a son serves his father, it's gamkim Mesiras nefesh. He has kabbalah sel, and here the Rebbe brings the word Mesiras nefesh back. To be sure, the son has greater Mesiras nefesh than a servant does. Now, this does not say at all in Samachvov. You have it in two places, in Perek Yud and in Perek Mamalef. In Tanya, he's Metayin to Memdalet. It's in Perek Mamalef also. He's Metayin to Memdal, but it's in Mamalef also. Kibro de ishtarul basaravui v'imei. Yate megamei v'nafshei v'ruche v'nishmase, like a son who's Moisa nefesh. He gives away his goof and his nefesh and his ruach and his neshama lemisa for his father and his mother. So this is it's an interesting thing that the Zohar says exactly the opposite of what the Gemara says. The Gemara says that a father has more Mesiras nefesh for a son than a son has for a father. And the Zohar says the other way around. And the Rebbe quotes that Zohar to argue that a ben also has the capacity for Mesiras nefesh and for Avedas Ovid. The son dedicates himself to the will of his father more than he does for himself. And for himself doesn't only mean the son, it can mean the father also. So the Rebbe fuses together Avedas Ovid and Avedas Mesiras nefesh. And he says it's true not just of Pashat people, but Faket, bigger tzaddikim have it even a greater extent, even though it says in Samachvav otherwise. The bottom line is that Rebbe joins together Avedas Ovid and Avedas Mesiras nefesh, and he says that's how you do this is Hapchach HaSheichel and Heda. And he finishes this paragraph is the idea of making this world home for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Idea is Hapcha, which requires Avedas Ovid and Mesiras nefesh, Avedas Mesiras nefesh. And this is our generation. So the Rabbi explained it, even from Mesiras nefesh. This is again the mind from the Friedrich Rebbe called Tzivas Hashem, because the idea of a soldier is Mesiras nefesh. And like I said before, normally the Maimorim separate an Eved from a Chayal. That Eved has Kabbalah Seil, and a Chayal has Mesiras nefesh, and the Rebbe makes them into one and the same thing. So once the Rebbe established the job, which is this hapche, and that it requires Mesiras nefesh and Avedas Eved, because in this Mamer he links them. He says the Eved is a ben and the ben is an Eved, and they're both with bittul and Mesiras nefesh. He now continues in Perek Beis, Umavayer behemshech ha-Mamer. The Friedrich Rebbe goes on to say in the Mamer, like I explained to you in my introduction, that there is the mission, which is 9 prakim of the Hemshech, is Hapcha. The Friedrich Rebbe calls it Iskafia is Hapcha. The Rebbe mentions only is Hapcha. Iskafia is not mentioned to the last few lines of the Mamer, as I believe I said before. And he gives 3 examples: Karbanis, Shtos Kedusha, and transforming Sheker into Keresh and Kesher. And then, of course, the second half of the Maimon is who does it. The answer is the Tzivas Hashem with the koyches they get from the Melech and the Bizbuz Ha'etis. So now what's going to happen? He's going to explain this now. The Rebbe continues. A war of an earthly king. There is a certain design. Just like on earth there's a way a war is fought, similarly Lamaila there is a way a war is fought, and it's Nishtal Shlumehem, right? Malchusa the Arakain, Malchusa the Rekia. We see it backwards. We look how kings fight wars physically and we deduce how the Eibishter fights a war, but in reality the Eibishter is the source, and the way it happens on earth is the manifestation, is the consequence of it. But we learn it backwards. That in the Melchom of La'afichas Shecher Ha'olam, transforming the lie of the world. To be a seat for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we have to learn how that war is fought from a Melech Basav Adam. And again, notice he doesn't say Lich Fois to bend. He doesn't mention his kaf. He mentions only his hapcha. And he says that a king was fighting a war. And like I told you before, there's something called the Melchemes Nitzachim. When he's fighting a Melchemes Nitzachim, he's machnas as the B'tachsisi Melchama. Is called and lastly, but not least by any chance, so the Rebbe now goes into the sugi of Oitzer, which is what dominates the Friedrich Rebbe's Mamer. Said the king gives so that the war should be won. The most precious treasure. If you can understand what precious is, this is the most precious of what is precious. A king, one of the things that defines royalty is treasure. But most people have what they need. A king needs to have, because part of the grandeur of the kingship is not just the resources that he needs for dispensation, for practical use, but for the honor of the kingdom. And for this you have treasure. Also have a kibbutz that was stored and gathered, him and his parents. It's so precious that it's the most precious amongst what is precious. Moreover, one of the symptoms of that preciousness, or one of the ways of preserving the preciousness, is that it's gnuzim b'kamus, it's hidden away from all eyes, and nobody can see it. Not only does the king that used this treasure, it doesn't show it, because showing the treasure will diminish its value. Usually things have a value on an open market. Rare items, single artifacts have a value which goes beyond what you can trade in an open market, but they usually have a relative value. Then you have some things that their value consists of not having a value, if you can't put a price on it. And one of the symptoms of something that you can't put a price on is that its value and its mystique is preserved by being invisible, by not seeing it. That's what treasure is. Nevertheless, when a war is being fought, and it's a Mechames Nitzachah that you have to win. And like the Rebbe explained in Mistam Tafshin Chaf Aleph, maybe Chaf Beis, Tafshin Chaf Aleph, that a Mechames Nitzachah means it has to be fought exactly this way and won exactly this way. So in order to win this war, he dispenses of this treasure in a reckless way. Bizbus, he doesn't give them away responsibly, he just gives them away. To whom does he give it? To his soldiers. The truth of the matter, it is going to be discussed in Perek Yudches of the Frierdiker Rebbe's Mamer, but the Rebbe goes back to it often, that the treasure is given to the generals, to the prominent members of the government. The real reason the king gives out the treasure is the common soldier who stands on the front and fight and doesn't run. The treasure is for him. The koiches are given not for the general who makes the decisions, but for the soldier who stands and fights. He's a pashta person, and he represents the nitzachan of the melech. And all the treasure is given ultimately for his purposes, for his sake. They should be able to be victorious. That's a physical idea. The kings, in times of war, become irresponsible with their wealth because you have to win at all costs. So the Rebbe says, it's like physically, that's what happens when kings fight wars, especially when it becomes a war of principle, a war of victory, that they pull out all the stops. The same is true when it comes to Lakus. Like it says in Tanya Perek Beis Gimel, what's happening down here is a symptom of how things are l'maylo, that since l'maylo nitzachin follows this pattern, this is why down here in this world, that's how kings behave, that's how kings fight wars. To win a war. And the victory of Israel, meaning to say the midas and of the Eibishter. It comes from Madrega completely above Seichel. When a king, especially a king's midas and tzochin is aroused, even when you're talking about Malka Shalom the Eibishter, it's a truly infinite thing and he can't lose. So, Bishvil Zeh, in order to win, and winning has to be done at all costs, Mevaz Bezimel Mailo, it's dispensed recklessly from on high, as Kol Ha'etis, all the treasure, V'neis Nemeisam An Shachal, given to the common soldier, through the intercession, to the immediacy of the generals. And the Rebbe explains what is the treasure. So before we talked about, in the first Perek of this Mamer, he mentioned Yireh Shamayim, because of Moshe Shebekol Echad V'Echad Yireh Shamayim. In the second paragraph of this Mamer, he connected to the Inyan of Mesiras nefesh. Now we connect it to Yireh Shamayim again, but now we actually says directly that it's connected to Oitzer. It's explained in other places. And in footnote 21, he's mitzayin to the Mesiras Magid and to the Teira Eid and to the Sefer Erchem. But it's not in Basi Legani. The Rebbe said it many times. The Frierdiker Rebbe did not say what the treasure is. The Frierdiker Rebbe simply explained where the treasure comes from. and how potent the treasure is. But the treasure that the Eibishter gives us to win this war is Eitzer Sheyireh Shamayim, which is of course the Gemara, is the Rebbe's word. She'eitzer Shalamayla and Yonahu, what is the treasure that the Eibishter gives the Jewish people to help them win the war? Eitzer Sheyireh Shamayim, a treasure of Yireh Shamayim. Now what does this mean, a treasure of Yireh Shamayim? What does it mean, a treasure of Yireh Shamayim? I told this to you before in previous classes, that the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, who was a far more colorful and expressive Rebbe in terms of showing endearment and affection and recognizing people, when he would write letters, he would have very, very elaborate titles. Our Rebbe was incredibly conservative about all of these things. I don't know the reasons, but that's the Mesiras. The Frierdiker Rebbe could write 2 or 3 or 4 lines of titles. The Rebbe almost never wrote more than a line or a line and a half. For the biggest Gedalim, the Rebbe had expressions that are used for every single Yid based on the Frierdiker Rebbe's, but the extra titles he did not have as much. If you study the Frierdiker Rebbe's Igros, when I was a teenager, the Frierdiker Rebbe's Igros were published, and I would read them every night. And I would pay attention. So you see that as elaborate as the titles are, they're very carefully chosen. And one of the titles, which is almost never used, is the title Yiras Hashem Hi Eitzari, this one, that the fear of heaven is his treasure. The Rebbe uses it by, the Frierdiker Rebbe uses it by our Rebbe, his son-in-law, and by the Rebbe the Masmid. And I saw it once by the Dov Meir Rabinovich. Once, there's many letters to the Radam, but in one letter it says Yiras Hashem Hi Eitzari. And one of the Chassidish Rebbes, it's not a title that I use often. Yiras Hashem Hi Eitzari doesn't mean you fear God. It means you have the treasure of Yireh Shamayim, you have the resource, you have the essence of Yireh Shamayim. Yireh Shamayim is bittul, and bittul is Mesiras nefesh, as we learned before. Yireh Shamayim means a sense of Hashem that's so deep that you put Him ahead of yourself. Kibrod ishtad lebosar avivi imei, umaser nafshen alayim lamisa, v'garmei v'nafshei v'ruchi v'nishmasei, yatem v'garmei v'nafshei v'ruchi v'nishmasei. A son who puts his parents ahead of himself. So Yireh Shamayim is avdus. Yireh Shamayim is Mesiras nefesh. Yireh Shamayim means Hashem is so real that there's nothing more important than that relationship, and you sacrifice everything for that relationship. Yiras Hashem Eitzarei means you own that. You own that recognition. You own that awareness. You own that priority, which is incredible. For a person to have a mindset, actually, and there's nothing in the world besides for Hashem, and nothing matters besides for doing His mitzvahs and chas v'shalom, not doing something which is against His ratzon, to the extent that you could say that that earnestness is your oitzer, is the way the Mamer is playing. It's a gift. Oitzer Yireh Shamayim is Eibishter's oitzer. It's His treasure, and He gave it to us. Some people somehow have taken possession of that treasure and made it their own. When it comes to Milchama, the King gives the treasure away to all of us. Does it become ours in the Madrege which is the Masmid? I don't want to say the Rebbe because it's not Bechala lays day in bad Inish. Obviously not. But there's a koyach given to each person in a time of Milchama for Eitzer Yireh Shamayim, which is not based on their own personal avoid, it's based on what they're doing. That's how you have to explain it. In other words, you go on Shlichus, you do the Rebbe's work, the Rebbe's Mefasbes Eitzes. You acquire a Yireh Shamayim which is not your own. And that Yireh Shamayim isn't even avodas of it. That even Yireh Shamayim is even Mesiras nefesh. Shalzeh Amr, as the Gemara says, Hakavidei Shamayim chutz Yireh Shamayim. Everything is in the hands of heavens. Everything that happens is b'hashgacha pratis. Yireh Shamayim is free, free will. Hashem does not interfere, and you have to find within yourself the strength to access and manifest that avdos, that bittul, that Yireh Shamayim, that Mesiras nefesh, and the Eibishter gives it to us. This treasure is given to the foot soldiers who are engaged in the war, to make from this world a seat for godliness and a holy place for the holiness of Lakus to rest. And they do this with Mesiras nefesh, they do this with Avedas Ovid, they do this with Yireh Shamayim, to the extent that the Eibishter gives them the Yotze of Yireh Shamayim. Now the Maimonim talk about bittul and Yireh, and the idea that all levels of Yireh are the same because the base of Yireh is bittul, while the base of Ava is Yesh, and that's why there's a lot of levels in Ava. But in Yireh there's no level. That's why it doesn't say Yitzchak twice, like it says Avram twice, and so on. But the bittul is in the neshama. but bittles in the neshama in the kind of way that if and when we bring it out, it's ours. It's Hashem's treasure, but it's Hakal b'dei Shemaim chutz miyiras Shemaim. He gave us the treasure, and now the treasure is ours. Meaning, He gave us the treasure, and we have to access and actualize the treasure through our avodah. So to go back to the analogy, a young man goes on shlichus, and he's doing the Rebbe's work, and the Eibishter, the Rebbe, gives him the Eitzer Shel Yidden Shamayim. That means that he has the possibility of accessing that kind of mishmas, that kind of bittul, that kind of Mesiras nefesh. But if and when he does it, it's him, it's not the Eibishter. The Eibishter gave him the Eitzer. So there's a strange dichotomy or duality to it. On the one hand, the Eitzer Shel Shamayim is Hashem's Eitzer. And the Mamer explains that it's the Madrigas of Ein Seif, which are the Maila Maila Aden Kates, hidden and even more hidden. The Lashon and the Friedrich as Mamer is. Helam achar helam, be'ilah achar ilui, beheder ha'oir, beheder ha'gilui. And it's given to us in the kind of way that it's ours to choose to actualize. See, as they say, Beda Milas. First of all, the Maila of being very deep and very divine, and second of all, the Maila of it being earned. So I'm stuck on this Mamer. In other words, I'm not stuck on Basi Legani, I'm stuck on this. I'm stuck on Bittel, on Eitzer Shel Yidden Shamayim, and Mesiras nefesh. Now that I've added something else. Vehine. Inyan, this idea that we just discussed, that in order to the Avodah V'Shabcha, which is making the Mishkan and Mikdash Le'Yizbarach, you have to Bittel the Mesiras nefesh and Yira. She'Yisrael, Nekroim, M'Shem Tzivas Hashem, the Jewish people are called the army of Hashem. Ve'evid ma'avedasam b'Mesiras nefesh, you that avodah with a Mesiras nefesh, which includes al derech zeh nesinas ha'oitzer shel hamayla. The Eibush that gives them the treasure, which is the source from which the Mesiras nefesh and the bittul and the yira comes. So that on the one hand it's a koyach that comes from the Eibush, and on the other hand it's a koyach that they bring out of themselves. Hakel b'idei shamayim, but chutz miyira shamayim. So the Rebbe has one more point. It's especially available in the generation which is the Hila Mashiach. This Yira, this Avodah Sevet, this Mesiras nefesh is more available now than it ever was. This is this Maimon. That Basi Legani is spoken to us. And the Rebbe is saying to us that as we are, the Ikras Mashiach, we were given Eitzer Elyon, and Eitzer Elyon, Eitzer Shel Yidden Shamayim, and it gives us a koyach for all of these incredible things, more than our ancestors. Shavei des ha-Mesiras nefesh alehem, but take a base of Mesiras nefesh of our generations is more than earlier generations. And he brings before like it doesn't Teira and if you look in footnote 23, you'll see it doesn't say in Teira exactly. It says that Teira. It says the first source is really the Rebbe Rashab and Ein Tes, I think. The idea is attributed to the Alter Rebbe, but the Alter Rebbe is not so clear. On the pasuk, Moshe Honor made Mekalad Meshapnei Adam. Moshe Rabbeinu was humble next to every person on the face of this earth. So the Alter Rebbe explained, and the later Rebbe repeated that the Alter Moshe Rabbeinu saw der v'der manhigam. Moshe Rabbeinu saw all the future, and he saw our generation, the generation of Hila Mashiach, and he was humbled next to us more than any other generation. Why? So in the Maimarim of the Friedrich Rebbe, they connected to Mesiras nefesh. The Mesiras nefesh of our generation makes Moshe Rabbeinu humble compared to us. And in the Rebbe's Maimarim, he brings the inyan of al yevish mefnei hamal'igim, not to be in the spoil from the world, and do what you have to do, no matter who likes it or doesn't like it. And that's the Mesiras nefesh that the Rebbe is talking about. That's the Eitzer Shel Yidden Shamayim that the Rebbe is talking about. That's the Avedas Ava that the Rebbe is talking about. So the true or the primary place where Moshe Rabbeinu's humility showed itself was Mefnei Dor, because the Mashiach of the generation, which is the Mashiach. That Mach Masam Mesiras nefesh shall have their Mesiras nefesh. Sha'oim dim betake, if they stand hard Mefnei Kol Amaniyas v'Yikuvim, all blockages and all obstacles, all blockages. And he brings what I said a minute ago, Befrat of the Amal'igim. He doesn't bring the Mesiras nefesh like it was in Russia. Magit Allah. The be'apam harguish, the scoffing, the laughing, the looking at you and feeling pity for you, because you're nebacha, yid mit abord, you're afraid mit hashetel. Ube'ef and the al yevish of the amalik, if a person doesn't let these scoffers get to him or her, and they serve Hashem boldly and proudly and overtly. Shem sich nicht. And this Mesiras nefesh, this Yiras Shamayim, this Avedas Ovid is brought out more in our generation than in any generation before us. Why? So obviously the simple answer is because it's darker. The Golus is darker. And the darker the Golus gets, the more difficult things become. And like we learn in Hasidus, the darker the Golus gets, the more we get close to our Yechidish nefesh. But I want to add what I believe is the pshat in this Mamer. You must understand that this Basi Legani, which is 6 pages long, is a review of Perek Tezvav of the Basi Legani of the previous Rebbe, right? That begins in Perek Gimel. And it ends in Perek Hey. Okay, a little bit of Perek Vav. In other words, less than half the Mamer studies Perek Tezvav. More than half the Mamer talks about soldiers, war, Mesiras nefesh, Avodah. But what are we going to explain in this Mamer, which is from Perek Tezvav? The answer is going to be the idea of Ein Seif L'mayla Adein Kates, but in Perek Tezvav, Ein Seif L'mayla Adein Kates means Tzimtzumim. Like I told you before, and I explained it in the previous shiur that I gave in the Mamer from Chafei, that Perek Tezvav says that what is L'mayla Adein Kates? The koyach to hide from the world. Perek Tezayin introduces the idea of Elikus of Helam, godliness of hiddenness, which is hard in Revelation. But Perek Tezvav is B'Klalusa Yidden Tzimtzum. Those are the words of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So to me, the word is like this: Tzimtzum hides the Eibishter. To Tzimtzum hides the Eibishter, it should be a world. So now we're adding that Tzimtzum hides the Eibishter to reveal the Eitzesh HaYireh Shamayim. The Tzimtzum hides the Eibishter to reveal the Keach HaMesiras nefesh. That's how I'm spinning it. That's why I think the pshat in the Maimon is. The Perek Tezvav is going to say that Ein Seif L'mayla Adein Kates is the idea that there's a koyach of Elikus, to hide Elikus, which is called Ein Seif L'mayla Adein Kates. And the reward for hiding Elikus, which is a helam, which allows the world to exist, creates a space for us to do our job. And because there's more tzimtzum and more helam and more hester and more meni and more ikuv in our times than in earlier times, there's a greater expression of that Mesiras nefesh. I believe that's the pshat in this Maimon. I don't know. But I think that the Hemshech, the connection between the Perek Tezvav of the Maimon and the totality of the Maimon, Basi Legani, where the totality of the Maimon speaks about Mesiras nefesh, dir b'tachtonim, basoli mikdash, tzadikim yeshuaretz, is that the tzimtzum that brings out these higher koiches. The hiddenness of the Eibishter reveals the hidden Eibishter within the Yid. And he adds something else. V'zehu gamma. This also explains something else. The fact that the avodah is hapcha. And this hapcha makes the dir b'tachtonim, this hapcha makes the whole world, b'chol echad v'echad miyisrael, the Eibishter should rest. And the koyach with this hapcha comes from avodas ovid and from Mesiras nefesh and from Eitzesh HaYireh Shamayim. All of these gifts result in something else, which is what? That Shaydei avodah zu dafka dis avodah boyim le'inyan asiyas hamikdash le'yizbarech. It allows us to build the third Beis HaMikdash. As the pasuk says, v'asali mikdash v'shechanti b'seicham, Hashem gave us a command. Hashem gave Moshe Rabbeinu a command to build him a sanctuary, and he promises to sit in that sanctuary. So the Rebbe says, Shazeh Koilo, this includes Gam as HaMikdash HaShishi, also the third Beis HaMikdash. And as you'll see in a moment, in a certain way, it includes the third Beis HaMikdash more than any other Beis HaMikdash, for the simple reason that the third Beis HaMikdash is eternal. And he brings that Rambam, and I'm not sure why he brings this Rambam, but he brings the Rambam, which goes over Rambam. The Rambam holds, the mitzvah of building any Beis HaMikdash, and if I'm not mistaken, even building every shul, Nilmedes is part of the mitzvah saseh of Vasali Mikdash v'shechanti b'seicham, the Mishkan she'asa Meisha Vasali Mikdash. There's one mitzvah saseh. Mitzvah saseh last is bayis, muchad, lahakir, beikarbonis. The first one of those is described in the Torah by Moshe Rabbeinu. The second one is described in Sefer Malachim by whoever wrote Sefer Malachim. And then the third Beis Mikdash is in Yecheskel. The second Beis HaMikdash is in the Mishnayos, which the Rambam chooses to explain. So the mitzvah of building any shul, of any Beis HaKnesses, any Beis HaMikdash, is learned from the Torah in Pashas Truma that has built me a house. And he brings a raya. Hamshech, the Rambam says beferish, v'chein binyan ha'asad le'ibonis, the house which will be built, Hainu Abayis Ashlishi, the third Beis HaMikdash, that even though Shul Kosta be a Cheskel, it's written in the Navi, a name of Furish, it's not explicit or Mavur, and clear. And Anshe Payisheda, when they built the second Beis HaMikdash, they built it like the first Beis HaMikdash, which they knew clearly how to build it. Uke'enu and Yonim, a little bit like the third Beis HaMikdash, what they understood from the Psukim, especially the Mizbeach, I think. So also the mikdash includes all batei mikdash, including the final Beis HaMikdash. Thus, it recalls all batei mikdash that were destroyed or buried until the Beis HaMikdash, which is eternal. Which means the third Beis HaMikdash is like the second Beis HaMikdash, and I think when he says the second Beis HaMikdash, he means all the batei mikdash before it, like the second and like the first and like the Mishkan. The third Beis HaMikdash, in a certain aspect, is a part of that mitzvah. Just like you say about Mashiach, there is a Melech HaMashiach as the last Lamed, and he's no different than any other Melech, Malchus or Kshedim, except for his Hatzlacha. The same is true. The third Beis HaMikdash is a Beis HaMikdash like any other. It's a Beis HaKnesses like any other. Basi, Beis Fili, Yekar, L'chol Ha'am, except the fact that it's a Nitzchi. So if they're all the same, what makes this one special? If they're all the same mitzvah, for also the Mikdash, why does the third Beis HaMikdash last forever? And the answer is the Mesiras nefesh, and the Avodas of it, and the Yidden, and the Eitz Ashir Shamayim. Says the Rabbi, Yes Ashlishu Beis Elamim Ha'amiti. The third Beis HaMikdash is the true house of God, or Elamim means eternal house. Kihu Bayis Nitzchi, it's an eternal house. And the eternity of the third Beis HaMikdash is even more than the Mishkan. The idea that the third Beis HaMikdash is eternal is understood in a way of certitude from the Mishkan. In other words, it's even higher than the Mishkan. But the Mishkan, al derech mikdashos of Mesha, that the Chazal say, kol ma'as yedei Mesha nitzchim. The Mishkan was never destroyed; it was only buried because Moshe Rabbeinu made it. And Moshe Rabbeinu does this forever. But Moshe Rabbeinu's forever is, if I may use Yossi, b'derech the third Beis HaMikdash forever is b'derech. The Mesiras of health itself. It's even deeper. The Basi is a yibana b'mehera b'meinu mamish. This Beis HaMikdash is going to build very speedily in our times mamish. Ayadei, as a result of Maseinu, V'avedaseinu, the work and the labor we do. Be'efen shall tzivas Hashem. And what's tzivas Hashem? Eitz Ashir Shamayim. What's tzivas Hashem? Avedas Ovid. What's tzivas Hashem? Mesiras nefesh. B'teich Mesiras nefesh k'mein Mesha. Who was a Yidden Mesiras nefesh, and that's why he was Eichad to his Ma'aseh Yedei Mesha is Nitzchi. But the third Beis HaMikdash is even more of a Nitzchi. So b'meila, it makes sense that the avodah that we do at the end of times of Golos, when the Golos is the darkest, and the Golos being the darkest means it's the maximum circumstance of the inyan of Eretz Seif L'mayla Din Ketz, the Kus is hiding. And in those circumstances where there's the maximum situation of Eretz Seif L'mayla Din Ketz, because the Kus is hiding, you have the maximum gilui of the Mesiras nefesh of a Yid, the maximum gilui of the Eitz Ashir Shamayim of a Yid. And that affects that the third Beis HaMikdash should be eternal. The eternity of the third Beis HaMikdash should do with our Mesiras nefesh. That's the Rebbe's word. And we do it Mesiras nefesh like Moshe Rabbeinu, who's both an Eved Neman and a Ben Neman and an Eved Pashut. You see, the Rebbe uses three terms: Eved Neman, Ben Neman, Eved Pashut, and then Eved Neman would have to say. Eved Pashut, Eved Neman, and Ben Neman, and Eved Pashut, and Ben Pashut. I guess that would be the opposite of that. And the Rebbe concludes when we tell him that this is the reason. This treasure, which is so precious that no one even sees it, is given away specifically to our generations. So the Rebbe is explaining the Eitz Ha'elyon is Kabbalah Seil and Bittul and Yerushalayim and all the rest, the Mesiras nefesh. And we have it more than anybody else. And I'm explaining what I think the pshat is because we have the most tzimtzum. Perek Tezvav is about tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is the koyach to hide. The koyach to hide reveals the koyach of Atzmos. And the koyach of Atzmos builds the third Beis HaMikdash in the kind of way that it's an eternal house of God. So although the Seder of the Mamer doesn't entirely support what I'm explaining, allow me to maintain this order, right? The Rebbe is going to explain tzimtzum. That's what this Mamer is about, tzimtzum. Many tzimtzumim, very, very high tzimtzumim. Tzimtzumim before tzimtzum Rishon. And in the next Mamer, the Mamer of Chamish Asa B'Shvat, is going to explain all these tzimtzumim of B'Shvat Yisrael. Deeper. What are these tzimtzumim for? There should be able to be a world. But here we're learning that these tzimtzumim are not only here so there should be able to be a world, these tzimtzumim are here to reveal Eitz Ha'elyon, to reveal Hashem's treasure. Now we're skipping Pei Gimel, we're skipping Pei Dalet, and we're going to page Reish Chaf, and we're reading the last paragraph of Perek Hey, the second paragraph, the third paragraph on the top of the page, because I'm jumping around. I'm going to read these few lines on page Yeshchaf, and then we're going to go to the end of the Mamer. And again, I'm teaching you the Mamer as I see it. We just said that the Tzimtzum, the hiding of godliness, reveals the Eitzesh Yireh Shamayim, Dina Mesiras nefesh. But there's another thing. The hiding of godliness reveals something else. And before I read it, I want to explain it, because the language of the Mamer is a little bit unclear. In other words, someone's going to come along tomorrow and say, Paltiel, du beschaffst Welten, was existiert nicht. You're making up stuff that doesn't exist. But Lani is daiti, this is the pshat, so I will teach it the way I understand it, and let those who disagree with me please come forward and tell me. And either I'll convince them, or they'll convince me, or we'll remain stubborn, or we'll convince each other, whatever the case is. There's another thing that Tzimtzum accomplishes. If the first thing Tzimtzum accomplishes is that it reveals the Kerech HaMesiras nefesh, the second thing that the Tzimtzum accomplishes is that it reveals the Tmimus of a Yid. We all know the Chassidus. That a ish pasha the like the pshitas ha'atma was a simple person took the simplicity of the Eibush to himself, more than a tzaddik and a goen and a kodesh. And one of the things we say in light of that is the statement, "Ani mispala l'da ze hatinik." There's a sefer called Derech Mitzvah. In the sefer Derech Mitzvah, there's a mitzvah called mitzvah sheirish mitzvah tefillah. And in the Mamer Sheirish Mitzvah Tefillah, the Rabbi, the Tzemach Tzedek, brings the Tshuvas HaRivosh, who quotes other Rishonim. It's a whole pilpul that they're having. And the Teichen of the pilpul is a simple question: should a person be mechaven the seidus of Kabbalah when he davens, or not? And there's a source for each. There's sources for each. One source is the Chazal saying, "If the Yisrael tzeikim be'enim nenem, b'veish einam yedim l'chav b'shem." Jews scream to the Eibush, and the Eibush doesn't respond because they lack the kavanah of the shemis. On the other hand, it says, which you can have later in this shir, at the end of this Mamer. You want to talk to the Eibush, the not is midas. Atzmus, right, the Mamer of B'yei Mash Yossi. I'm not going to say Malka, not even Svidus. So which is it? It's a Tzadik's conclusion that you have to have a combination. You have to serve Hashem like a child, but you also have to understand like the Lashon of the Yom Yom of Chav Tammuz, the drachem to the Elam Yisrael Yenim, the pathways to heaven. But Chassidus and the Rebbe especially makes a very big deal of this notion of the mind of a child. Children speak directly to the Eibush himself because they're not smart enough to start thinking about hierarchy. There's the Eibush. And one of the places where this notion of Atinik plays out is when it comes to Tzimtzum. And we talked about this in the Mamer Basi Legani Tafshin Chaf Hey, because the Rebbe spoke about it there, and we're talking about it now again. And I need you to understand that what I'm about to say, I'm 90% sure it's Pshat in the Mamer, but I'm also 10% not sure that it's Pshat in the Mamer, because it's not explicit, but it's quite implicit. I'm teaching it this way without equivocation. I'm not going to give you another alternative, although I myself am not sure if this is the correct Pshat. In Teireh, in Pashas Vayeri, the Alter Rebbe talks about Tzimtzum. And we also know that in order for it to be Tzimtzum, there has to be a concept of Mokum. And from the Mokum, there could be a Tzimtzum, it could be an evacuation. The Arizal is the first one that spoke about the Tzimtzum. Haramak lo yod minyan Tzimtzum as they state in Chassidus. Even though their sources go as far back as the Zohar that speak about Tzimtzum, but that's the Lashon Haramak lo yod minyan Tzimtzum. And the concept of Tzimtzum assumes a number of things. Number one, it assumes that there's space, which means it has to be only after Alei Saras. And number two, the space is full of Mokum, of Eir, and the Eir is not allowing the Amidas Eilamis. And number three or four, that the Inyan of Tzimtzum is removing the Eir. So it's the big machlokes amongst the Kabbalah where the Tzimtzum is Kipshut, the Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshut. But the Alter Rebbe in Teireh Vayera adds another thing, which is a much bigger idea than simply the idea of the question whether Tzimtzum is Kipshut, Shalei Kipshut, and that is that the whole machlokes amongst the Kabbalah has been a to Eir. Tzimtzum of Eir is Kipshut, Shalei Kipshut. There is a Tzimtzum in there, but it's real. That means the Eir is not here, or it's not here, not real. The Eir is still here, but we just don't see it. And the Alter Rebbe holds Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshut. But he says only in Eir. In Moed, he says Adarabah HaMoed Ubezgalos. The source with a capital S is never removed. The Tzimtzum and Eir has nothing to do with Moed. And the Pshat is, since the Eibush is Mesiras, the Mesiras built in Mesiras Nimtza, he doesn't interfere with anything. Hashem could be here, and Hashem could be Begilin. He's not disturbing us because his Mesiras is an Eifen of Eini Motzi. Mesiras built in Mesiras Nimtza. It is a very, very big additional Chiddush. The first chiddush is that the tzimtzum is shaleike pshute, and the second chiddush is that the tzimtzum is only in oyer, and mar there's no tzimtzum. And the Alter Rebbe creates this expression, which is so important. At the time of the maximum concealment of the Eibishter, you see Atzmas. The light of the sun is what doesn't let you see the sun. The light of Ein Sof is what doesn't let you be aware of the Eibishter. But when the light is removed, you're closer to the Eibishter than ever. And that's what the Rebbe is about to say. The Ish Pashat, who's a Da'azeh Atinik, who when he speaks to Hashem is speaking like a child, because he's too simple to be more sophisticated. It's the lack of understanding of the Eibishter, the lack of revelation of the Eibishter, which brings him closer to the Eibishter himself. In other words, this Mamer in Perek Tezvav is about Tzimtzum. So the first idea is that in the place of Tzimtzum is the revelation of Ke'echa Mesiras nefesh, like the Rebbe said in Perek Aleph and Beis of the Mamer. And the second idea is that in the place of Tzimtzum, there's a gili of the tmimus of a yid, that the pshitas from Ish Pasho, the lying, the pshitas ha'atzmas, at the simple Jew simplicity touches the simplicity of the Eibishter himself. And that's what we're going to learn now. And we're going to read just this one paragraph on page Reish Chaf, and the rest of it we're going to do with him in the next shir. Inyan hatzimtzum v'ahelam. We explained in this Mamer, based on Perek Tezvav of the Fidik in Rebbe's mind, that Klalusia, Inyan hatzimtzum, and Seif l'mayla din kates means Tzimtzumim. And in this Mamer, the Rebbe's machadash that there's many Tzimtzumim for Tzimtzum edition. So the Rebbe says, Einei inyan shal chasarin. It's not only, or it's not at all a lack. Tzimtzum means to take away oyer. It's a negativity thing. It's the opposite of good. It's bad. First godliness was here, and now godliness is removed, and that's a bad thing. Where it's also a bad thing. The removal of Ein Sof effect, you come closer to the Eibishter himself. Because the light doesn't let you see the source. And when the light is removed, you're closer to the source. As the Rebbe Marash explains in his classic work, everything in this world, you would think that the entire reality is a figment of our imagination and it's not real. And faket, you would argue that Mitzad Achdas Hashem, it's not real. The problem is, if Mitzad Achdas Hashem, they're not real, then your mitzvahs aren't real either. But rather, even though there's so many tzimtzumim, there's so much Ein Sof l'mayla in case which affects the Lagabi element is a helam behester. He Mesiras hamitis. In the place of darkness, the world is still true. In the place where you don't see godliness, the world is still true. Now, how is the world true if the godliness is removed? And what we see of the world seems to be separate from the Eibishter. And the answer is because what we see is coming straight from the Eibishter himself, from the Yeshua Miti. In the beginning, Hashem created heaven and the earth. And the Chassidus explains the Eibishter is not a liar. If he wrote in his Torah that he created the world actually exists. Achdas Hashem offsets the possibility to the world to exist. It's a very good question, and it deserves an answer, but it doesn't change the fact. The Torah doesn't lie. The Torah says Hashem made a world, so there is a world. Zog pshat v'devilt, but there is a world. And that world is discovered in the place of Hela Behest. If the light of Hashem is revealed, you're never going to think the world is a chizas einayim, because you see godliness. When the godliness is removed, and you therefore see only the world. So you ask the question, is this world true or false? And you want to think it's false. And then they tell you, no, but it's true. So the absence of godly light gets you to the point where you ask the question about achizas einayim and find the answer, which is that the world is atzmos. The place which we live in, which is absent of godliness, is an expression of God himself that we can only see because the light is missing. The mitzad, because the light is removed, you could make the mistake of saying that the world is a bluff. When godliness is revealed, you're not going to say the world is a bluff because the world is godly. When godliness is removed and the world seems to be by itself, you can say, check it, and then you answer, no, it's not check it, it's atzmos. The helam of the world is the truth of the Eibishter himself. Aval emeti, the truth is, the reality, the form of everything is hamitis, Yossi hamitis, the truth of the Eibishter's Mesiras, and it's not nechizas einayim. The Achdas Hashem is seen in the concealment of the Eibishter, which allows for the creation of this world as an expression of him. So the lumdus here is that achizas einayim means that the world is a lie. Means the world is true. But Bereishis bara Elokim es Hashemayim means the world is true because it's created by the Eibishter himself. The light doesn't allow you to ask the question and doesn't let you give the answer. The darkness allows you to ask the question and get to the answer. That in a place where you don't see the Eibishter and you see a world, the world as you see it is not a lie. The world as you see it is Atzmus, but in a state of hell. Hamayru is gas, but there's no light. What you see is the Eibishter himself. And of course you could be maidech in the idea how the concealment of the creation is really the Eibishter himself. But this is what the Rebbe is saying. That Perek Tezvav Basi Legani speaks about Tzimtzumim. And in Mitzvah Hashem in the second class in the Mamer we're going to read Perek Gimel and Daled and parts of Hey and Vav where Tzimtzumim are discussed. But the Tzimtzumim hide the light, and in the absence of the light we reveal Ke'echa Mesiras nefesh, as the Rebbe said in the beginning of this Mamer, and we reveal the Tmimus of a Ish Poshet that knows the Eibishter himself, Lada'at Atinic, because of the Hamoyer Hu B'His Gas, the source is revealed, as you see on the next page, because the light is not there to take it away from him. He's able to ask the question of Achiz Esinayim, and he's able to give the answer of Bereishis bara Elokim. Now go to page Reish Chaf Aleph and continue 4 lines into the page, and it's going to be a repetition. Remember, I'm moving it around. So it's the same shtickle twice. This what we're about to learn is very similar to what we learned just now, but there's a few more oasis which will explain to you where I took it from. Now the Ramarash explains the Hemshech, which he said I think 12 times in 18 years as a Rebbe. Even in this world. There are many concealments and contractions. Is the presence of the Eibishter. Now the lashon that he uses is the gam, and if you want it, you can use the word the dafke. In the Elam Esalyenim, Oid is revealed, and in the Elam Esalyenim, where Oid is revealed, there's no motivation to look for dichalein. You're nispal from Giluyim. In other words, even though the language of the Rebbe suggests that the Eibush is also in this world, but the teichen of the Rebbe's words is that the Eibush is dafke in this world. That in the place of Tzimtzum v'Helam, you're closest to the Eibush's pshitus. And he brings the Teireh that I talked about. The East, the Teireh, the Pashas Vayero, the Zeh, Shem Shemaim Shagav V'Kela, that even simplest people, simple men and simple women and children, all talk about the Eibishter. And they mention the Eibishter's name, and they don't understand much, but they still talk about him anyway. I always say that the most difficult concept in the whole creation is God. And everyone has an opinion about God that most people thought about it for less than 5 minutes. So why would you have an opinion about something which is so difficult to understand if you thought about it for 5 minutes? And of course the answer is because it's not a big deal. That's what they say. But the real truth is because they know God. We all know God. We don't know God in our minds and our hearts. We know God in our etzen because the essence is revealed. And in simple people who are not smart, the fact that the essence is revealed shows itself in them talking about the Eibishter. That when there's no light, the source with a capital S is revealed. And Dafka Tinekes Nami Haaretz are able to talk about the Eibishter with a simplicity because they're not distracted by Yiluyim. Children also know there's an Eibishter. And Mistami he's been signed to the Hagos of Paschalio. But there's a Mamer of the Frierdiker Rebbe as well, which is his Galus Ha'atzmus, the revelation of the Eibishter himself, which is Be'el Mazed, Be'el Matachim Dafke in this world. And that's the second chiddush of this Mamer. The first chiddush of this Mamer is that the Tzimtzumim bring about Ke'echa Mesiras nefesh. And the second chiddush of Mamer that the Tzimtzumim bring about the inyan of Lada'at Atinic. The Tzimtzumim bring about the idea of Shem Shemaim Shagav V'Keil between Nashon and Me'oretz Dafke. So the Tzimtzum is necessary to create worlds. And if you learn the Basi Legani Tafshin Chavhei, that's what he explains, that Tzimtzum is necessary to create worlds. And the way that Tzimtzumim exists, they're Ma'al Master and Lakus. In this Mamer, the Tzimtzumim exist to create the Yidden Mesiras nefesh and to create the Yidden Tmimus. And he connects it to the Alter Rebbe. Like I told you in my introduction, all the Rabbeim are listed in order from the Mittel Rebbe, Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek, Rebbe Marash, Rebbe Rashab, and the Alter Rebbe is at the end. The Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid are not mentioned in this Maimon at all. They're mentioned in the Maimon of Abba Rosh Hashanah. It's also Pshat in the Alter Rebbe who says, and this Alter Rebbe is not in a Maimon, it's in a Yem Yem. Look 56. Hayem yem. I'm going to read you the whole Hayem yem. Okay, forgive me for using my phone. But Matziyim v'kurim tovkuf nevav b'lojne. Omar Rabbi Nazakin Teira b'Rabbi. Now the Rabbi said a Teira. And Kinog Oz Drushim Ketzarim was very short. Although in Tovkuf Nevav there's already quite long Maimorim. This was a throwback to the short Maimorim. He quoted the pasuk, Mi kadeshem Elokeinu b'chol karenu elav, who was like the Eibishter b'chol karenu elav. Whenever we call him, he responds to us. After we call him, we're calling him. So he brought the Mamer Chazal elav v'leila midesav. Then we call him and not his midas. So the Padre says elav means the oiros, v'leila midesav, and not the kelim. And the Baal Shem Tov said, Elav means the lakus of the Kalim themselves. And then he said, the simple meaning of Elav is Atma Ein Sof. Even though the Pardes explains Elav means oil, which goes into Kalim. Leila Midesa means not the Kalim. And the Baal Shem Tov touch Elav, the lakus of Kalim, and not the Kalim by themselves. But the simple touch of Elav means Hashem himself. That through simple Amun, every Yid, even the simplest Jew knows it. And that's the Tayit B'chol Kainu Elav, we're krevim elav, we're close to the Eibishter. Or b'chol karenu means that the atmos of Ein Seif and the atmos of the neshama are very connected, and this is the idea of davening with emunah pshuto, which connects the atmos of a neshama with atmos of Ein Seif, which affects all the brachas of reifach chelim and barach hashanim. So there's a fancy elav elav medesav. The fancy elav elav medesav means eir versus keli, or lakus versus matzias. And the simple Elav Midaisov means Hashem and not the Sviris. Right? Like I told you a few times very lately, that this is offsetting this is the Mamer of B'yei Mashta Yasser. Anon the Siv Malka means the Eibishter and not the Sviris. So the Alter Rebbe has this pshat, Elav Midaisov, that it doesn't mean a lakus, it means a lakah. Kavana hilat musi is barach, the Eibishter himself. When simple people, children and simple men, v'anoshim and simple women, mispalim elav yizborach davening him directly. And I wrote on the margin what the Rebbe says in a different Basi Legani, and I'm going to look for the source and write it down. That this is the same. You haven't said in Yiddish. That the Baal Shem Tov used to travel around and ask people, "How are you?" And they would say, "Geleib der Eibishter, Adank der Heilige Bashefer." They would thank the Eibishter in common Yiddish words. So the Rebbe says the way they thanked Hashem, not using Shemus HaKdoshim, but using common words, is the same idea as Elav Aleila Midesav. Harei Tfilasam he, when the simple people talk to Hashem in a simple way, it's Elav Aleila Midesav, the Eibishter himself, Atzmuse, Umuhuse, Yizbarech, Ube'efen, the B'chol Kareinu Elav. Then when we're calling him and him alone, and he brings from Tanya, Seif Pedek Lamed Zayin, that Kriyas Geben Akeda Liyaviv, Gadam Akeda Lechaveri. Kriya means you're calling someone to come to you. And Kriya, Elav, B'chol Kareinu, we're calling whom? We're not calling Yidden Seif, we're not calling Atzilas, we're calling the Eibishter. And he responds to us. This calling the Eibishter responds to us is specifically by simple people. That because they're not smart, when they talk about God, they're talking about God, not anything else. And Laniya's Daiti, the Rebbe is saying that this is one of the effects of the Tzimtzum. Peirik Tezvav speaks about Tzimtzumim, and the Tzimtzum removes the air that allows us to be in the Madrega of Elav Aleila Midesav. So, we learned the beginning and the end of this Mamer. And what it taught us is that the Eibishter has an inyan of Yidden Seif, L'mayla Mayla Dein Kates, which means the idea of godliness being hidden. And in the absence of godliness, you reveal the Keach HaMesiras nefesh and the inyan of Tmimas. So the oitzer, the treasure, is what's revealed because of the concealment. When you hide oir, you get in touch with etzem. When you hide giluyim, you get in touch with oitzer. And what is the oitzer? The oitzer of Mesiras nefesh and the oitzer of Tmimas. And he finishes this Mamer. It explains the substance of the work that we do in the generation which is Hill of Mashiach, which is such a low generation. The Davka we say that we find ourselves in this time. As darkness covers the earth. And this of course means the greatest degree of Tzimtzum. And Isham Gufa there also. And if I may add there especially, Tzorech liyas inyan atfila be'ef, and we daven today b'shtan alev v'lev v'leilim midesov. K'maymer ani mispal as atinik. We talk to Hashem like a child in the absence of being smart. We're simple. In our simplicity, we touch the simplicity of Atmos and Hussein Tzav Baruch Hu. That tefillah atinuk is al Atmos kana. The prayer of a child touches Atmos. And of course, this is compounded by the inyan Mesiras nefesh and Avedas Ovid and Eitzesh Yiresh Shamayim, which we use to make the Beis HaMikdash to the Aveda V'Zhabche. Both of these Avedas are attributable to the Tzimtzumim. Both of these Avedas are attributable to the L'mayla Adein Ketz, and they are the revelation of the Eitzer. So if I may say so, Eitzer Ha'elyon is Eitzer Yiresh Shamayim. And now we're learning Eitzer Ha'elyon is Eitzer Shel Tmimus of Ish Poshet. By days and through this, mamshich and mikashchina lemata, bring the ikashchina to this world on a lay, akashchina stam ikashchina. Ikashchina. Now what's ikashchina? Look at the first page of the first Mamer, the first Basi Legani of the Rebbe. But also the ikashchina, right? Malchus and Malchus Dein Seif and Lifnei Tzimtzum. But in the first Basi Legani, Pedek Aleph, ikashchina is still only shchina. Here the Rebbe says Atmos and Husyas Baruch. Ikashchina is not the highest level of shchina, it's Mamish the Yibishter himself, which the Rebbe spoke about after the Maimir. In the Maimir of Toshin Yadal, Basi Legani, Ikashchina means the highest madrega of Gili Elikus, the highest madrega of Malchus. Here it means Atmos. Ubefraten especially. Ayadei Ma'asein Avedasein Beifin Shal Maisa, we do our Aved in a way of action. Or to quote the beginning of this Maimir, Avedas Ovid Mesiras nefesh and Yiresh Shamayim. And of course, Maisa means we force ourselves in Lashon Ma'asin al Tzedakah. Kimavur b'kama drusha Chassidus, and Chassidus explains. And of course, there's a Igeres HaKedesh. V'hoya Maisa Tzedakah Sholem. Avedas Tzedakah Hashke Revetach Adeilam. I think it's Igeres. And in that Igeres HaKedesh, he speaks how Avodah is greater than Maisa. Avodah is Avedas Ovid. And Maisa is L'shtikul Geluyim. It's not as hard. But even Maisa is also Asiyah Lashon Kfiyah. So for this Maimir, it's enough. Masein of Avedas Seinu. He could become a drusha Chassidus that even Maisim is ma'asin al tzedakah to force yourself to do it. Allah has kama v'kama avedas of it. And he mentions the word iskafia. I told you that in this Maimir he only speaks about iskafia. The dirib tachtenim is through iskafia. Here he speaks about iskafia. What's the iskafia? Not what you're doing to the world, but what you're doing to yourself. You're changing the world. You're transforming the world by bending yourself. Here's the infinite avodah. So he explains beside the word Ma'aseinu, inside the word Avedaseinu. V'adei zeh boim l'gili ikashchina lamata, reveal ikashchina lamata, which means Atmos Mahus Yizbarach. Begula amitis v'ashleim ha'idei Mashiach tzidkeinu, and the Rebbe finishes his words b'meheira b'yameinu mamish. So we learned the beginning and the end, which is exactly what I did 13 years ago when I taught the ladies this shir. This shir is probably longer than that shir because I have more time. The part that I skipped last time, which is the reason I want to teach this Maimon, I have to do tomorrow. That's the part about Tzimtzum. It's fancy, it's schmancy, it's talking about Kabbalah and Ishtalshlos and Elam, it's very nice. But this shit is life. This shit is not philosophy and mysticism, this shit is life. And as far as that goes, this shit is far more powerful and far more important than this shit about Tzimtzum. But b'li neder b'Eitz Hashem Baruch will do it tomorrow. A good Yom Tif, L'shana Teva, b'li medach Chassidus, b'dach Chassidus, Tekosev v'sechosim, a good Tanakh, like it says in the Tzavah of the Magid v'Yoshin, a good Tanakh v'Yoshin. Yoshin means al ibelein enachamo. Yoshin means al ibenayin, befrischen, abfrischen, nicht schlafen. Yeah, okay, chazak.